Imagine a man who stands by the throne for 40 years. The throne changes. Prince Igor sits on it. He is murdered in the woods. His widow, Princess Olga, takes the seat. She dies a natural death. Her son, Sviatoslav, takes over, who is killed by a river, his skull turned into a drinking cup. The grandson, Yaropolk, sits. She is stabbed to death in a hallway by his own bodyguards. 4 rulers, 4 violent or suspicious deaths. One state that is torn apart every single decade. And the man by the throne remains exactly the same. He saw every one of these deaths. Some he predicted. At least one he allowed to happen. And every time he remained in his place. His name was Sveneld. By the time his name flickers for the last time across the pages of the primary chronicle, he will be well into his 70s. For the 10th century, that is an almost impossible age, especially for a warrior. Most of his peers are already lying in burial mounds from the Volga to the Danube. But he is still in Kyiv, still standing by the throne, still alive. And here is the strangest part. This man possessed every resource needed to become the prince himself. He had his own army, richer than the prince's own, his own tribute-paying cities, his own connections with the Varangians across the sea. Over 40 years, there were dozens of moments when the crown lay practically at his feet. Not once did he reach out to take it. Why that is the central question of this story. Spring 945, the Derevlian forest near Iskorostan. Prince Igor is tied to 2 bent birch saplings. The trunks are released, and his body is torn in half. This is how the Byzantine historian Leo the Deacon describes the execution. And a 2-day ride away, in Kyiv, sits Sveneld. He commands the main part of the state's retinue. He holds the bread, the silver, and the Varangian mercenaries. He could have marched out. He did not. From this exact moment, his true story begins. The Chronicles say very little about Sveneld. His name surfaces at crucial junctures and disappears again, as if the chronicler knew this man was everywhere, but couldn't quite figure out how to describe him. By title, he is a voivode, a warlord. In essence, he is a Varangian mercenary who rose to a level where a mercenary no longer sells his sword, but decides whose sword to buy. Under Igor, he receives entire tribes as his personal tribute fiefdoms, the Uliks and the Derevlians. Under Olga, he commands the army. Under Sviatoslav, he marches alongside the prince from the Volga to the Danube. Under Yaropolk, he effectively runs the entire state. There is one detail from the chronicle that is worth remembering. Igor's retinue complains to the prince, "Sveneld's men are adorned with weapons and fine clothes, while we are naked. Sveneld's men are dressed better than the prince's men, armed better, fed better." If you think about it, this is not a complaint against a warlord. This is a recognition that in mid-10th century Kyiv, there are 2 centers of power. One sits on the throne, the second stands beside it, and the second one is richer. This is the key to our protagonist, a man who had every conceivable resource to stage a coup chooses to remain in the shadows. Why he does this will become clear by the middle of our story. This is a story about power that doesn't need a crown, about how, in a fledgling state where the rules had not yet settled, one man figured out the formula before anyone else. True strength does not lie in a title. True strength lies in controlling who collects the taxes and who pays the army. The crown attracts knives, the shadow does not. Sveneld lives by this rule for 40 years, and for 40 years it works. And then it breaks in a single day. Because of one hunt in the woods, because of one murdered son. The perfect pragmatist who outlasted 3 princes commits the one act he had never allowed himself. He makes a decision with his heart, not his calculation, and instantly everything crumbles. The 10th century. Rus is not yet a country in the way we understand it. It is a network of cities along rivers, connected by a single trade route from the Varangians to the Greeks. Kyiv, Novgorod, Smolensk, Chernigov, nodes on a string down which furs, honey, wax, and slaves flow from north to south, while Byzantine silk, Arab silver, and wine flow from south to north. The prince in this network is not a king in the European sense. He doesn't have a capital as we understand it, nor a standing regular army, nor a tax service. Every winter, he personally travels around the subordinate tribes to collect tribute, a practice called poliudi. If the tribe pays, the prince stays alive. If they don't, the prince goes to war. If he gets greedy and comes back for tribute a second time, like Igor did, the tribe might just kill him. The prince's army is his druzhina, retinue. These are not conscripts, not a militia, but several hundred professional warriors who must be paid. Paid in silver, in fine Byzantine silks, in the right to a share of the loot. They must always be paid in war or in peace. If you fail to pay, the retinue leaves for someone who will. Often, they go to the Varangians across the sea, who can always be hired in Novgorod for more. Within this system, a mercenary commander has one option that a prince does not. A prince is bound to his tribe, his bloodline, his legitimacy. He cannot simply walk away and start over somewhere else. A Varangian can. A Varangian comes from the sea and can return to the sea. And that is exactly why it is far more convenient for a Varangian to stand beside the throne than to sit on it. Sveneld arrives in Kyiv when this system is still very young. He sees it from the inside much faster than the Rurikovich dynasty themselves, and he begins to play by its rules, with the sole difference being that he reads the rules much more carefully than anyone else. There are 5 years left until Igor's death, 27 years until the parting of ways at the Dnieper Rapids, 30 years until that fateful hunt in the forests of Oleg the Derevlian. He doesn't yet know that at the end of all this, there will be just one locked chest sitting in an empty great hall. But we already know. By the early 940s, Kyiv is not a city in our modern understanding. It is a port. Imagine a wooden fortress on a hill overlooking the Dnieper River. Down below by the water are wharves, warehouses, rows of merchant stalls. Long ships arrive from the north, from the upper reaches, and depart southward toward the Black Sea. On the docks, you hear Scandinavian speech, Slavic speech, Khazar, Arabic. The smell of pitch, fish, and wet wood fills the air. Silver is weighed on scales right on the wooden planks of the pier. Coins are chopped in half into quarters to pay the exact price. Almost no one uses a whole, uncut coin. This is not the capital of a state. It is a trading post around which a state has grown. At the head of this enterprise is Prince Igor, son of Rurik. He is already over 50, a highly venerable age for the 10th century. He has been ruling for over 30 years, and the most important thing to be said about him is this: he managed to hold on to what Oleg the prophet left him. He didn't expand it, he didn't reform it, he just held on to it. In 941, Igor attempts to take Constantinople. A fleet of the Rus, which Byzantine sources estimate at around 10,000 ships, reaches the city walls and burns. The Byzantines deploy Greek fire, a combustible mixture poured from ships and walls. The Rus longships burst into flames on the water. Those who jump overboard in their heavy armor drown. Those without armor burn on the surface because Greek fire does not extinguish in water. Igor returns with only a small fraction of his fleet and immediately begins preparing a second campaign, this time with a land army, bringing in Pechenegs and Varangians hired from across the sea. In 944, this second campaign reaches the Danube, and there the Byzantines meet Igor not with an army, but with an embassy, bringing gold, bringing silk, offering a treaty. Igor takes the gold and turns back. This treaty, signed in 944, is one of the first documents to explicitly list the names of the men standing beside the prince. The Chronicle has preserved the list of envoys. The names sound like this: Ivor, Vufast, Iskusevi, Sludi, Uleb, Kanatsar, Shikburn, Praston, Libiar, Grim, Svirka, Akun. 12 ambassadors, and the vast majority of the names are Scandinavian. This is not the Slavic nobility. This is the Varangian elite. Among these names, Sveneld is not yet listed. At this time, he is not a diplomat. He is a commander. And while the ambassadors are haggling over terms in Constantinople, he is working right where a Varangian commander is supposed to work, in the lands that pay the tribute. To understand exactly who Sveneld is, you need to understand how the economy of early Kyiv actually functioned. The prince does not have a state treasury. The prince does not have a regular standing army on a fixed salary. The prince has tribes that pay tribute, and a retinue that must be maintained using this tribute. Between the tribe and the retinue stands the man who collects the tribute. This man goes by different titles. Sometimes he's called a prince's man, sometimes a voivode, sometimes just by his name. The essence is identical. He is given a tribe as a kormlenya, a feeding/tribute fiefdom. He travels there in the winter, tours the settlements, and collects honey, wax, furs, and occasionally slaves. He remits a portion to the prince in Kyiv. He keeps the rest for himself to maintain his own men. Under Igor, Sveneld is granted 2 such tribes: the Ulich, somewhere around the lower Dniester River, and the Derevlians northwest of Kyiv, in the dense forests between the Pripyat and Teterev rivers. This is an enormous amount of wealth. The Derevlians are one of the richest and most stubborn tribes within Kyiv's sphere of influence. Oleg the prophet had to pacify them. Then, at the beginning of Igor's reign, they rebelled, and Igor had to pacify them all over again. The tribe is powerful, warlike, and has its own Prince Mal. Keeping them in submission is a full-time military and administrative job. For this job, Sveneld receives the right to take the tribute, not a percentage of the tribute, not a salary, but the entirety of the tribute, from which he passes a pre-agreed share to the prince. The rest is absolutely his. And here is where things get interesting. Prince Igor has his own retinues, several hundred men. They need to be fed, clothed, and armed. Their source of income is the tribute from all the tribes of Rus, minus whatever the collectors eat up themselves. So Igor receives, hypothetically, 9 parts out of 10. Sveneld has his own retinue, also several hundred men. They need to be fed, clothed, and armed. Their source of income is the tribute solely from the Derevlians and the Uliks. But he receives all 10 parts. His men don't share with anyone. As a result, it's simple arithmetic. Igor has more men in total, but calculated per individual warrior, Sveneld spends more. His young warriors are better dressed, better armed, and better fed. The chronicler will record this reality in a single phrase. It will be spoken in 945, right before the prince's death. Igor's retainers will say to him, "Sveneld's men are adorned with weapons and fine clothes, while we are naked, and this will mark the beginning of the end." Regarding Sveneld's origins, the historical sources are completely silent. The name is Scandinavian: Sveneld, Svenald, Svenald, variations of the same root, connected to the word Svein, meaning young warrior or retainer. Similar names are found in the sagas of 10th century Norway and Sweden. Most likely, he belongs to the 2nd or 3rd generation of Varangians who arrived in Rus during the time of Oleg. He might have even been born here in Novgorod or Kyiv. But he was raised strictly in the Varangian tradition, speaks 2 languages, and thinks in one. We do not know exactly when he first appeared at Igor's side. We do not know for what specific merits he was granted the Uliks and the Derevlians. We do not know if he already had a son at this point, that very Lyut, whose death 30 years later would decide the fate of the state. What we do know is his results. A man with the Uliks and Derevlians as his tribute fiefdoms is a man who controls the southwestern and northwestern flanks of Kievan Rus. This is a man through whose hands passes a massive portion of the grain, honey, and furs bound for Kyiv. This is a man who commands his own several hundred Varangians, highly trained, fully equipped, and fiercely, personally loyal to him. If Igor ever wanted to dismiss him, he would have to fight a war. If Igor tried to take the tribes away from him, the retinue would leave with Sveneld, and a huge chunk of the state would leave right along with them. This is not a servant. This is a partner. A junior partner, certainly, but an irreplaceable one. And here is a crucial detail that is very easy to miss. Throughout all these years, not once does Sveneld attempt to expand his authority. He doesn't demand a 3rd tribe. He doesn't meddle in the high politics of Kyiv. He doesn't participate in the Byzantine negotiations. He doesn't sign the Treaty of 944. His name is totally absent from the list of the 12 ambassadors. He sits quietly on his 2 tribes and steadily fattens his reserves. If you think about it, this is already a highly developed strategy. In a world where princes march on Constantinople only to return with charred ships, where ambassadors haggle over every piece of silk, where a retinue might mutiny over a single hungry winter, Sveneld has chosen the one role that won't get him killed. It isn't glamorous, it isn't for parade, but it is safe. The Varangian is reading the rules of this young state much more carefully than the grandsons of Rurik. By 944, the balance of power in Kyiv looks exactly like this. On the throne is the aging Igor, having just returned from the Danube with a treaty instead of plunder. His authority has severely plummeted since 941. Everyone remembers the devastating defeat by Greek fire. The retinue is grumbling. There is very little loot. The military campaigns are expensive. Beside him is his young wife, Olga, barely in her 20s. They have a son, Sviatoslav, who is 3 years old. If something happens to Igor, the infant heir cannot hold the state together. On the flanks are the warlords, Asmud, the tutor of young Sviatoslav, and Sveneld, the master of the Derevlians and the Oulegs. And now pay close attention. In this entire structure, the weakest link is Igor himself. He is old. He just lost Constantinople. He desperately needs money to pay off his retinue, and his retinue is looking at Sveneld's men, calculating just how many times richer they are. Any strong pressure on Igor will push him toward the simplest possible solution, the exact same solution his father Rurik tried, that Oleg tried, and which usually ends badly. Go out and take more tribute than usual, from those who are weaker, from those who are closer, from the Derevlians, from the very tribe that has been assigned to Sveneld for 30 years. The warlord doesn't know this yet, or he knows, but does absolutely nothing to stop it. For a man who has spent his entire life reading the rules more carefully than others, this is strange. Or it's not strange at all, if we assume he is already calculating several moves ahead. There is less than a year left until Igor's death in the Derevlian forest. Igor is over 55, possibly pushing 60. The exact date of his birth wasn't preserved by the Chronicle, only that he has been ruling since 912, for over 30 years. This is a remarkably long time for a 10th century ruler. Most of his peers from the Varangian elite have long since been buried in mounds. But not him. He survived the campaign against Constantinople, survived Greek fire, survived a second campaign and a humiliating treaty under which he had to surrender the right to duty-free trade to the Greeks. He survived, but he didn't forget. The Treaty of 944 is not a victory. It is an admission that Rus can no longer take Tsargrad, Constantinople, by force. You can trade, you can get silver for letting merchants pass, but the old campaigns for massive plunder, the kind that happened under Oleg, are gone forever. But the retinue still needs to be fed. Igor's retinue numbers, according to various estimates, between 500 and 1,000 men. These are professional warriors, Varangians, Slavs, Balts, a few Khazars. They all live off the prince. They are fed, clothed, and armed from the princely treasury. The treasury is replenished through the Polyudiae. The Polyudiae is the winter circuit, where the prince personally rides through the lands and collects the tribute. In the autumn of 945, Igor heads out on the Polyudiae as usual. The route is familiar, along the left and right banks of the Dnieper, through the lands of the Derevlians, Severians, Radimichs, and Viatikians. The tribute is collected. The prince turns back toward Kyiv. And it is right here that a conversation takes place, one the Chronicle recorded almost verbatim. The setting is somewhere on the journey back from the Derevlian land, perhaps at a camp by a river, perhaps at one of the Pogost's fortified tribute collection points. It is cold, early winter, fires are burning, with the smell of smoke and wet wool cloaks in the air. The retainers approach the prince. The chronicler calls them Otrokithe junior retinue, the ones who stand in the front ranks during a campaign. One speaks, but he speaks for them all. The phrase, preserved by the primary chronicle, Otroki Svenelzi, isodelicia sut orugium I porti, Aminadzi. Pojdi, kняже, s nami v dan, da I ty dobudoši, I mi. Translated, Sveneld's men are adorned with weapons and fine clothes, while we are naked. Come with us, prince, for tribute, that both you and we may profit. That is the entire conversation, 2 sentences. Then the chronicle immediately moves to the action. The prince listened, turned back to the Derevlian land, and took tribute a second time. But within these 2 sentences lies the entire mechanics of the Kievan crisis. First, the retainers do not compare themselves to Igor, they compare themselves to Sveneld, or rather to his junior retinue, young warriors just like them, and they realize, we serve the prince, they serve the voivode. We are naked, they are well dressed. Something in this setup is fundamentally wrong. Second, they do not demand that Sveneld share his wealth. They do not ask the prince to confiscate the warlord's cut. They ask the prince to go and take more from the exact same Derevlians where Sveneld takes his own cut. Third, this is pressure from the bottom up, which in Igor's system should never have worked. The prince is under no obligation to listen to his junior warriors. He is a Varangian of the house of Rurik, a descendant of Oleg, a ruler of more than 30 years. He can say no, and the retinue will have to swallow it. But Igor says yes. Why he does this, the chronicle does not explain. We can only guess. Perhaps it was his age. By 60, a character might soften or grow more bitter, but rarely more restrained. Perhaps it was because after the disaster with Greek fire, the prince's authority had sunk so low that mutinying behind his back became much easier. Perhaps he was simply exhausted and secretly envied how well organized his own warlord's life was. We cannot verify a single one of these theories. We can only record the fact. In the autumn of 945, Prince Igor turns his retinue around and marches back to collect tribute from the Derevlians for a second time in a single season. tribute that had already been collected by Sveneld. In not a single line of the primary chronicle during this scene does Sveneld appear. He does not approach the prince. He does not try to talk him out of it. He does not show outrage that the prince is marching into his designated tribe. He does not ride with Igor. He does not send a warning to the Derevlians. He simply vanishes from the frame at the exact moment the prince makes a decision that will end in his brutal execution. This is far too precise a coincidence to be an accident. Let's reason calmly. Sveneld has been collecting tribute from the Derevlians for over 30 years. He knows the tribe better than anyone else in Kyiv. He knows their Prince Mal. He knows the absolute limits beyond which the Derevlians stop paying and start killing. Better than anyone in Kyiv, he understands what go and take from them a second time actually means. If Sveneld does not try to dissuade Igor, it means either he couldn't or he chose not to. The first is highly unlikely. Sveneld is not some junior officer barred from the prince's presence. He is one of the two chief warlords of the entire state. Igor would have heard his word. That leaves the second option. He chose not to. We do not know his internal motives. The primary chronicle does not record the thoughts of warlords. But we do know the balance of power at that moment, and that balance speaks volumes. If Igor goes to the Derevlians and takes a second tribute, one of two things will happen. Either the Derevlians pay and hate Kyiv even more, or the Derevlians refuse to pay and kill the prince. In the first scenario, Sveneld loses a chunk of control over his tribe because the prince just bypassed him to take what should have flowed through the voivode. In the second scenario, the prince disappears, leaving behind a minor heir and a mother with absolutely no army of their own. In the second scenario, Sveneld wins far more. This does not mean he actively wanted Igor dead. We cannot claim that the sources are silent, but it does mean he had no strong incentives to intervene. And for a man who has spent his life reading the rules more carefully than anyone else, the lack of a reason to intervene is itself a decision, perhaps the most important decision of his life. Igor and his retinue return to the Derevlian land. He does not take everyone. The chronicle clarifies. He sent his retinue home and returned himself with a small retinue, desiring greater wealth. Meaning, he sent his main forces back to Kyiv, presumably carrying the tribute they had already collected, and he himself, with a small detachment, rode back to squeeze out more. This is a critical detail. Igor approaches the Derevlians not as a prince with an army. He approaches them as a tax collector with bodyguards. A few dozen men, maybe 100, against a tribe that has already paid once and has no intention of paying a second time. What happens next, we know from two sources, the primary chronicle and the Byzantine historian Leo the Deacon. The Russian chronicle describes it with restraint. The Derevlians, led by Prince Mal, marched out of the city of Iskorostan, met Igor, and killed him and his men. Leo the Deacon is far more detailed. According to him, Igor was tied to two bent young tree birches. The trees were released. His body was torn in half. Which version is more accurate is impossible to say. Perhaps both are true. He was killed in battle, and then his body was ritually executed. Perhaps Leo the Deacon recorded a rumor that reached Constantinople via merchants. But the essence remains the same. In November 945, the exact date is unknown, but indirect clues point to late autumn, Prince Igor, son of Rurik, ruler of Kyiv and Rus, perishes in the woods near Izhgorodin. He is around 60 years old. He had ruled for 33 years. Left behind in Kyiv are his widow Olga, in her early 20s, his son Sviatoslav, 3 years old, Sviatoslav's tutor Asmud, and Sveneld, with his own retinue, his own treasury, and his undisturbed tribute fiefdoms. Of all the men who could claim the role of regent for the minor heir, Sveneld is the only one who possesses everything required: the army, the money, the experience, the age, and a declared loyalty to the house of Rurik that he has never publicly betrayed. But there is someone else who possesses something entirely different for this role, something Sveneld does not have and will never have. Her name is Olga, and she has just become a widow. While she is weeping over the empty space where her husband's body should have been, a plan for vengeance is already forming in her mind, a plan so terrifying that the Chronicle will recount it with an almost awestruck horror. And Sveneld, during this time, does exactly what he always does. He sits in Kyiv and waits to see who he will have to negotiate with next. In Kyiv, they do not find out about the prince's death immediately. The distance from Izhgorodin to Kyiv is about 150 versts, roughly 100 miles. Over a winter road through deep forests, that is several days' journey, even for a rider. And news of this magnitude is never carried by just one messenger, but by several, in case one is intercepted. This means it reaches Kyiv in waves. First a rumor, then confirmation, then the gruesome details. Olga is the first to hear the rumor. She is in her early 20s. 3 years ago she gave birth to Sviatoslav. She is from Pskovnot, Varangian, but not entirely of Slavic nobility either. The Chronicle provides no firm details of her origin. Before 945, the sources say absolutely nothing about her character. She steps into history at the exact moment her husband ceases to be alive, and she appears immediately as a person who knows exactly what to do. Prince Mal of the Derevlians is not a young man. He is experienced and knows Kyiv very well. He did not kill Igor in a fit of hot rage. He killed him because he calculated. Kyiv is weakened, the heir is a child, the widow is young, and the army is divided among warlords who don't like each other. And for this exact scenario, he has a plan prepared. The plan is simple and, by 10th century standards, quite rational. Mal sends an embassy to Kyiv, 20 of the finest Derevlian noblemen. They carry a proposal. Olga marries him. The Derevlian and Kievan lands are united. Sviatoslav stays with his mother, but will be raised by a Derevlian stepfather. This is not a peasant's matchmaking. This is a high-level political merger. Mal is offering a peaceful takeover of Kyiv by the Derevlian dynasty as an alternative to a war that Kyiv, by his calculations, will lose anyway. His calculation would have been perfectly correct if the head of Kyiv was a normal regenta voivode, a Varangian, a man of his own age. Such a regent would have weighed the forces, recognized the weakness, and perhaps actually made a deal. But in Kyiv sits Olga. We have described her story in great detail in our previous episodes, and Olga does something Mal could never have anticipated. The Chronicle describes the princess's revenge in 4 acts, and all 4 have been preserved with such ritualistic symmetry that it's hard to believe their literal truth. But the core of all 4 acts is identical. Olga does not negotiate. Olga kills. The first embassy of 20 noblemen. She orders them to be greeted with honor, lifted up in their boat by hand, and carried into the city. They are carried straight to a deep pit dug in the courtyard in advance. They are thrown into the pit, buried alive. According to the Chronicle, Olga walks to the edge and asks them, "Is this honor to your liking?" She doesn't wait for an answer. The second embassy, 50 of the highest nobles. They arrive. Olga suggests they wash up after their journey. They are locked inside the bathhouse. The bathhouse is set on fire. The third Olga herself travels to the Derevlian land for a funeral feast for her husband, with a small retinue. The Derevlians meet her, lay out a feast. Olga's people pour the drinks. When the Derevlians are dead drunk, they are slaughtered. The Chronicle claims 5,000 men died. The number is almost certainly exaggerated, but the core action is real. And the fourth, the siege of Iskoristan. Now here is the most interesting part, and the most uncomfortable fact for lovers of simple explanations. In the Chronicle, Olga acts entirely alone. The chronicler explicitly names her in every single one of the 4 episodes. Sveneld is completely absent from these scenes. This is bizarre. By title, he is the widow's chief military advisor. By resources, he commands his own retinue, the very one dressed better than the prince's own. By experience, he has dealt with the Derevlians for 30 years, knows them from the inside, and knows Mal personally. And yet, he is not in the frame. There are 2 possible explanations. First, he is there, but the chronicler doesn't name him. It is highly characteristic of the primary chronicle to attribute actions to one key figure, even if they were actually executed by an entire team. When the chronicler writes, Olga buried the ambassadors, he doesn't mean the princess personally dug the pit with a shovel. He means it was done on her orders. The men who dug, threw, and buried, that was someone's retinue. Whose? It's not specified. Most likely, Sveneld's young warriors. The Kievan forces didn't answer to her by right of blood. The prince was dead. The heir was a toddler. They had no lawful commander. But Sveneld's men answered to the voivode, and the voivode took Olga's side. The second explanation. Sveneld consciously stays completely out of the way during the first few months. He doesn't interfere. He doesn't argue. He gives no advice. He lets Olga do exactly what she wants to do and watches to see if she succeeds. These 2 explanations do not contradict each other. Most likely, the truth is somewhere in the middle. His men are doing the work. He himself keeps quiet. For his long-term strategy, this is flawless. If Olga succeeds, she is right beside her, in his proper place, as a loyal warlord. If she fails, she is untainted by her decisions and can easily negotiate with the Derevlians separately. This is the true style of a grey cardinal. Never stand in the front. Never stand in the back. Stand at exactly the distance that allows you to step in any direction. By the summer of 946, Olga arrives at the walls of Iskorostan with an army. Here, Sveneld finally makes a clear appearance in the frame. Not by name, the Chronicles still attributes everything to Olga in this passage, but by function. Someone has to command the army. Someone has to handle the tactical decisions. Besieging a wooden fortress is not a ritualistic act of revenge. It is a complex military operation, and it is executed by men who know how. That is done by him and the voivode Asmud. Iskorostan is not a large city. Wooden walls on an earthen rampart, a few hundred defenders, maybe 1,000. The Kievan army is estimated by historians at 2,000 to 3,000. It's highly takeable. Yet Olga stands beneath the walls for almost a year. Why? The Chronicle does not explain. Probably the Derevlians defend themselves fiercely. Probably they still hope for reinforcements from other Derevlian territories. Probably a frontal assault on wooden walls always means heavy casualties, and the warlords do not want to sacrifice their men. And then the famous episode with the birds takes place. Olga offers the Derevlians peace in exchange for a purely symbolic tribute: 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from every household. The Derevlians rejoice. The price is absurdly low. Olga's men tie smoldering tinder to the birds' legs and release them. The birds fly straight back to their nests under the eaves of the wooden roofs. The entire city bursts into flames simultaneously. This story is almost certainly a literary invention. Similar episodes, burning a city using birds, are found in Scandinavian sagas, Byzantine war chronicles, and even earlier in classical antiquity. It is a traveling folklore motif that the chronicler grafted onto Olga's figure to emphasize her cunning. What actually happened, we do not know. Maybe an assault. Maybe the defenders suffered long starvation and surrendered. Maybe bribery and treason from within. Maybe an actual fire was set, but without the pigeons and sparrows. The historical fact remains. In the summer of 946, Iskorostan fell. Prince Mal was either killed or captured. Sources differ on his fate. The Derevlian nobility was slaughtered. A large part of the population was sold into slavery. The tribe, as an independent political entity, ceased to exist. And now a crucial detail that is rarely given attention. After the fall of Iskorostan, Olga does not return the Derevlians to Sveneld as his tribute fiefdom. Before 945, the Derevlians were his. After 946, they belonged directly to the crown. Olga introduces a system of uroki, fixed tribute amounts, and pogosts, administrative centers where tribute is gathered. The tax collectors are now the crown's men, not the voivodes. The voivode still receives a cut, but no longer as the absolute master of the tribe. He is now merely receiving a fixed stipend from the state treasury. This is the very first reduction of Sveneld's authority in over 20 years, and he accepts it in total silence. The primary chronicle does not describe the conversation between Olga and Sveneld after the fall of Iskorostan. There might not have been a single conversation at all. It could have been a series of negotiations, gestures, and mutual concessions stretched out over months. But the result of these negotiations by late 946 is starkly visible. Olga secures total political power in Kyiv. She is the regent for the minor Sviatoslav. She overhauls the tribute system, introducing fixed taxes and administrative centers, centralizing revenue and reducing independent fiefdoms. A few years later, she will become the first ruler of Rus to adopt Christianity in Constantinople. Her authority across the state, from Novgorod to Pereiaslav, only grows. Sveneld receives absolutely everything else. He remains the supreme military commander. He retains his personal retinue until one dares touch it. He loses the Derevlians, but in return, he gets something unrecorded in the chronicle, yet undeniably visible in his behavior over the next 20 years. An unspoken agreement that in all matters of war, his word is final. And one more thing. Olga makes Sveneld the military tutor of Sviatoslav alongside Asmud. The boy is 3 years old. He has 12, 15, 20 years of growing up to do, and all that time, Sveneld will be right there. He will teach him how to hold a sword. He will teach him to sleep on a horse blanket and eat roasted meat on the march. He will teach him that a prince is, first and foremost, a warrior, and a ruler only second. If you look closely, this was no accidental decision by the widow. It was part of the deal. Olga hands Sviatoslav over to Sveneld in exchange for Sveneld not challenging her regency right now. It is an unequal exchange. Olga rules right now. That is silver in the hand. Sveneld shapes a ruler for the future. That is a bet that might not pay off.
But he agrees, because he has over 20 years ahead of him to mold the boy into his kind of prince, while Olga has over 20 years to try to mold the boy into her kind of son. Who will win this silent, grinding war will only become apparent much later. Some 25 years later, when the adult Sviatoslav leaves his mother to die in Kyiv, while he marches off to the Danube with Sveneld. And 2 years after that, when the voivode makes his final choice between mother and son at the Dnieper Rapids. But for now, it is the winter of 947. Iskorostan is in ashes. The boy is just learning how to walk. After Iskorostan, Kyiv enters a long, deep calm. This is a rare period in the Russian history of the 10th century. Almost 20 years without massive wars, without marches on Constantinople, without thundering victories or catastrophic defeats. In the Chronicle, these 2 decades take up less space than a single campaign of Sviatoslav against Khazaria. And that fact alone is incredibly telling. The chronicler loves blood and movement. When they are absent, he falls silent. But behind this silence, the machinery that will determine all future history is turning. The state is changing. Olga travels through the lands, establishes the pogosts, fixes the tribute quotas.
She collects taxes under the new system without violence, but with iron firmness. In 955, or according to other sources, in 957, she travels to Constantinople and is personally baptized by Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenitus. She returns as a Christian to a pagan land, but she does not force her new faith on her people.
And the entire time, right beside her, is him, silent in his proper place with his loyal retinue. They lived side by side for over 20 years, not a single conflict recorded by the Chronicle, not a single alliance publicly proclaimed, just two people who once made a deal and held to it until the day she died. Regarding her origins, the sources offer three versions, none of which are proven. The first and most common: Olga is from Pskov, likely from a local Slavic noble family. The primary chronicle names Pskov directly. The second: she is Varangian, the daughter of Scandinavian nobility in Novgorod, and her real name is Helga, from which Olga is a direct translation. The third: she is Bulgarian, the daughter of a Bulgarian prince, and from Pskov, Pleskov in the Chronicle, is a corruption of from Pliska, the Bulgarian capital. We don't need to choose between these versions here. What matters is this: by 946, when she becomes regent, Olga is a young woman with no military force of her own, no powerful clan behind her, no brothers to back her up with swords. She possesses only a 3-year-old son and the name of her murdered husband. By any logic of the 10th century, she should have lasted a year, 2 at most. And then she would either be pushed aside by a strong voivode, taken as a wife by a neighboring prince, or murdered by her own people, by men who found it much more convenient to see a predictable man acting as regent. She will hold power for over 20 years, right up until her own natural death in 969. How she did it, the Chronicle doesn't explain, but the mechanics, if you look closely, are perfectly clear. Formally, power in Kyiv after 946 is structured like this. The regent is Olga. All decrees are issued in her name. She receives ambassadors. She sets the tribute rates. When the Byzantine emperor writes to Kyiv, he writes to her. When the German King Otto receives an embassy from Rus in 959, asking him to send a bishop, the embassy is from her. The chief voivoda is Sveneld. The military force of the state rests entirely in his hands. His retinue is the unbreakable core of any army Kyiv deploys in the field. His word is final on all matters of war. The tutor to the heir is also Sveneld, alongside Asmud. The boy is not raised at his mother's skirt. He is raised among warlords, in the environment of the retinue, on horseback, holding a sword in his hand from the age of 7 or 8. We need to pause on this last point. In the 10th century, raising a prince's son is not about pedagogy. It is about forging a future ruler to fit a very specific model. If the boy is raised by his mother, he grows up to be a politician, a diplomat, a man of the court. If he is raised by the retinue, he grows up to be a warrior, for whom the throne is nothing but a saddle. Olga hands Sviatoslav over to Sveneld, not because she doesn't love him, because she understands a boy raised by her
will not be able to hold the state together. A boy raised by Sveneld will hold it, but he will not grow up to be her son. He will grow up to be the son of the Varangian retinue. This is a fully conscious price she pays. She purchases the present stability of her regency with the future of her son, and Sveneld is buying himself the next 30 years. Because the boy raised in his arms will take the throne in 15 years, and the very first thing he will do is go to war. And in war, you need someone who actually knows how to fight. And that someone will be him. They both understand this perfectly, and they silently agree. By 946, Sveneld has more than enough military strength to take Kyiv by force. That might sound drastic, but the simple arithmetic proves it. His personal retinue is the most combat-ready unit in the entire Kievan military. Olga, in a military sense, has no men of her own. She has Asmud, but Asmud is a tutor, not a general. She has the Kievan city militia, but sending a militia against professional Varangian mercenaries in an open field isn't a battle, it's a slaughter. If Sveneld had wanted to, he could have taken power. Perhaps not immediately, as Prince killing the widow and the infant Rurik would have been political suicide. The Slavic nobility would never have forgiven it. But as sole regent, completely sidelining Olga, easily. It's the 10th century. Coups like this were happening in every second state in Europe. He does not do it. We don't know why. The sources are absolutely silent, not only on his motives, but on his internal life altogether. In the Chronicle, Sveneld is always a function, an action, a title, not a single phrase spoken directly from his perspective, not a single recorded thought. But we can reconstruct his logic based on how he behaved his entire life. If he seizes power, he instantly becomes a target. Any rebellion by the Slavic nobility, any new Varangian warband arriving from across the sea, any neighboring prince, everyone will have a legally justified reason to attack him. He will spend his life defending himself, fighting endless wars, bleeding silver from his chests to hire new mercenaries. He will just be waiting until someone younger and hungrier comes along to slit his throat, because youth, unlike silver, cannot be replenished. If he does not seize power, he remains the supreme military commander under a regent who has no army of her own. That is to say, he remains the de facto ruler, just without the heavy crown on his head and the knives that inevitably come with it. The choice is obvious. To him, at least, it's obvious. And here we must state something that gets lost in most retellings of this era. Sveneld is not just cunning. Sveneld is quite possibly the first man in all of Rus who managed to separate actual power from the royal title. Before him, Varangians arrived and immediately sat on the throne. Rurik, Oleg, Igor. After him, they will do the same. Vladimir will take the throne. Yaroslav will take it. But Sveneld is the only one in several generations who realized that you do not have to put an equal sign between sitting on the throne and ruling the state. This is not merely a personality trait. This is a profound discovery. And he makes it centuries before it becomes a standard political norm in Europe.
From 946 to 969, absolutely nothing happens in their relationship, at least nothing known to the Chronicles. Olga rules. She rides out on the Poliudi. She is baptized in Constantinople. She receives ambassadors. She dispatches her own ambassadors to Germany. She builds pogosts. She restructures the entire tribute system. She grows old. Sveneld commands the army. He conducts minor campaigns against surrounding tribes, the Viaticians, the Severians, those who haven't fully accepted Kievan dominance. He collects his share of the tribute. He grows old alongside her. Sviatoslav grows up. By 15, he is already a hardened warrior, not a princeling wrapped in silk, but a fighter in chainmail, sword in hand, conditioned to sleep on the bare earth and eat meat sliced into thin strips, roasted over coals, without bread or utensils. This is exactly how the Byzantine historian Leo the Diaconoman, who saw Sviatoslav with his own eyes, describes him. This image is not accidental. It is the deliberate, calculated result of the work of Sveneld and Asmud. They did not raise an herthe, raised a warlord prince, a man for whom Kyiv is just a staging ground from which you launch a campaign, not a place where you sit on a throne and govern. Olga realizes exactly what this will lead to. Her entire life's work has been a colossal effort to hold the state together in one piece, to keep it from crumbling. Her son, raised by other men's hands, will do the exact opposite. He will spend the state on endless wars until there is nothing left to spend. The Chronicle preserved one conversation she had with her Sona, later one in the 9060s. She begs him to be baptized, just as she was. He refuses. How can I alone adopt a new faith? My retinue will laugh at me. She tells him, if you are baptized, everyone will do the same. He refuses to listen. It is a short dialogue, but if you read it carefully, it contains the final score of her silent war with Sveneld. Olga lost. She raised a state, but she failed to raise a son in her own image. He does not listen to her. He listens to the warlord who taught him how to grip a sword and how to despise anything that cannot be packed into a saddlebag. In 969, Olga dies. In Kyiv, she is buried according to Christian rites, exactly as she requested. No pagan funeral feast, no massive pyres, no sacrifice of slaves. Standing next to her burial bed is her Sona, fully grown man of 26 or 28, a prince, a warrior, a pagan. And somewhere close by stands the man who forged this warrior. By this time, Sveneld is nearing 60. He outlived Igor. He outlived Olga. He now holds in his hands an adult prince whom he has known since the boy was 3, and for whom his word carries an authority far higher than a mother's. The chain that had held him back for 23 long years finally dropped. Now he can play the big game. And the next 3 years, from 969 to 972, will vividly demonstrate exactly what he will turn this newfound freedom into. To the east of Kyiv lies the Khazar Khaganate,
a massive trading empire through which all the Volga trade flows into the Arab world. To the south, Bulgaria and Byzantium, and standing beside the young prince who has just buried his mother, is a retinue that has been waiting 20 years for a truly great war. A great war is exactly what they are going to get. The Sviatoslav live in the dense forests along the upper Oka River, where cities like Ryazan, Tula, and Kaluga will later stand. It is a massive tribe, powerful and deeply isolated. It's a land of forests, the roads are rivers, the towns are fortified settlements on high river bends. The economy relies on wild honey, hunting, and slash-and-burn agriculture. Since the mid-9th century, the Sviatoslav have paid tribute to the Khazars. According to the Chronicle, they pay a shilling, shilyag, per plough silver coin for every ploughshare. This is a formulaic phrase from the primary chronicle, and it is likely stylized, but it perfectly captures the reality. The Sviatoslav are tributaries of Itil, not Kyiv. For Kyiv, this is an exposed, unsecured flank. As long as the Sviatoslav pay the Khazars, the northeastern border of Rus is practically non-existent. Any Khazar raiding party can move right through Sviatoslav lands to the Oka and straight on to the Volga. Every merchant caravan heading north or east has to pay customs duties twice, once in Kyiv and once in Itil. But the most critical factor is this: as long as the Sviatoslav belong to Khazaria, you cannot strike Khazaria directly. If you do, you are attacking the overlord of your own neighbors, and those neighbors will rise up to fight on the overlord's side. Which means, first the Sviatoslav, then the Khazars. This is not the strategy of a 20-year-old glory-seeking prince. This is the strategy of a man who has been counting the cards for 40 years. A 20-year-old prince wants instant glory. He would have marched straight on Itil, just as his grandfather and great-grandfather blindly marched on Constantinople. Sveneld steers him north, where there is less glory to be won, but where the absolute key to the grand war lies waiting. And Sviatoslav obeys. This is a vital moment. The prince's first independent military campaign is not one he thought up himself. It is precisely what his voivode advises him to do. And while the Chronicle, in describing these years, names Sviatoslav as the protagonist, the cold logic driving the actions is definitely not that of a 20-year-old. The Chronicle describes the campaign against the Sviatoslav in a single, sparse line. Sviatoslav marched to the Oka River and the Volga, and, encountering the Sviatoslav, he asked them, "To whom do you pay tribute?" They answered, "To the Khazars we pay a shilling per plough." That's it. Nothing more. No word of massive battles, brutal sieges, or heavy losses. But we know exactly how such campaigns looked in the 10th century, from archaeology, and from detailed descriptions of similar campaigns launched by their neighbors. The army travels by river. Longships are the primary mode of transport. The men live on them, sleep in them, and haul their provisions in them. By day, they row or sail if the wind is fair. At night, they pull up to the bank, light fires, boil a porridge of millet and salted meat, and set up the watch. They never take off their armor. There's nothing to take it off for. On a campaign, a warrior in chainmail eats, sleeps, and washes in his armor.
The food on the march is exactly what Lear the deacon described when he saw Sviatoslav. Meat sliced into thin strips, roasted over the coals. No cauldrons, no utensils, no bread is only taken at the very start of the journey. It runs out fast and rots even faster. From then on, you eat whatever you can forage. Fish from the river, game from the woods, cattle seized from local settlements. Porridge is a luxury, only made when they set up a prolonged camp. They drink water straight from the rivers. Rarely do they have beer or mead brought with them. Wine on a campaign is almost non-existent. It is extremely expensive and transported exclusively for the prince and the top warlords. Horses are not used for combat. They are strictly for moving between rivers. The primary instruments of war are the longship and the soldier's legs. In a forest war, a horse is a liability. It can't push through dense thickets, and it will drown in a swamp. Now imagine the scene. 60 or 70 longships sliding down the Oka River. In each ship, 20 to 30 men. In total, around 2,000 hardened killers. To a forest-dwelling tribe, this is a massive army that you simply cannot fight in an open field. You can hide behind the wooden walls of your hill forts. You can set an ambush at a narrow river bend, or you can retreat deeper into the woods. But you cannot win a direct clash. The Viatici understand this perfectly. The Chronicle does not describe massive battles, because in all likelihood there were none. What happened was a systematic occupation of key hill forts, a terrifying show of force, negotiations with the tribal elders, and a renegotiation of exactly who now received their tribute. By the autumn of 964, the Viatici have been completely reoriented toward Kyiv, without a massive bloody war, without extermination. Just a simple change of address for their silver shillings. And right here is where the real work begins. Between the Viatici and Khazaria lies the winter. It has to be waited out somewhere. And this very winter is the most crucial event of 964,965. Sviatoslav and his army winter somewhere along the middle Volga. There are no exact coordinates, but the logic of the campaign suggests somewhere around the future city of Murom or further upstream. The army sets up camp, settles in, and survives on stockpiled provisions and hunting. 4 brutal months of snow, freezing cold, and short, dark days. This is a period of time that does not make it into the Chronicle, but it is the most critical phase of the entire campaign, because here, in this frozen winter camp, Sveneld accomplishes the exact thing for which, perhaps, this entire massive expedition was launched. He finishes the prince's education. We do not know the exact words spoken between them. The Chronicle was not there to record the campfire chats of the warlord and his student. But we know 2 undeniable facts. First, by the spring of 965, Sviatoslav is a fully formed, absolute military commander. He is not a growing talent. He is not a promising youth.
He is a fully realized general commanding an army of several thousand men who in half a year will execute one of the fastest, most devastating military campaigns of the entire 10th century, the total annihilation of Khazaria. Second, in all his subsequent wars, Sviatoslav replicates the exact same tactical model over and over. Rapid, relentless marches, a single crushing strike at the enemy's absolute center of gravity, total contempt for slow positional warfare. Traveling dangerously light, we eat what we kill or forage. Absolutely no alliances that last longer than the next winter. No supply bases to slow him down. This is not the traditional Slavic way of war, nor is it a direct copy of Varangian tactics. The Vikings fought differently. They raided coastlines and fled with the loot. This is something entirely different. It is almost a steppe model. Fast cavalry, a short-draw bow, minimal baggage train. Sveneld, a man who spent 40 years observing every war fought around Rus, Byzantine, Pecheneg, Khazar-Tuk, all these schools of warfare, and fused them into one. And now he hands this ultimate weapon to his student. There is one specific detail that makes all of this incredibly convincing. It is the famous phrase of Sviatoslav, which Leo the Deacon records in one version and the Russian Chronicle in another. I come at you, idu na vi. The prince, preparing to march to war, actively warns his enemy in advance, giving them time to gather their army and meet him in the open field. At first glance, this is a gesture of pure chivalry, honor, absolute nobility. At second glance, it is cold, lethal calculation. If you warn the enemy, he will gather his entire army and march out to meet you. And to gather an army means putting it all in one convenient place. And if it is all in one place, you can butcher it in a single afternoon. You won't have to spend the next 3 years hunting down partisans in the swamps and forests. I come at you is not chivalry. It is an invitation for the enemy to bunch up so they are easier to slaughter. Mothers do not teach a formula like this. A formula like this is taught by a man who has spent 40 years calculating exactly how much every extra week of a war costs in silver and blood. It is taught by Sveneld. By the spring of 965, the young prince and the old voivode are standing on the upper Volga with an army that has fought through one campaign, survived a brutal winter together, and fused into a single weapon. They have a map of the routes, they have allies among the Viatici, they know the fords, the crossings, and the safe campsites. Ahead of them lies Khazaria. By 965, the Khazar Khaganate is a pale shadow of the terrifying superpower it had been a century prior. It once controlled the entire steppe from the Caucasus to the Dnieper, extorted tribute from its neighbors, fought toe-to-toe with the Arabs, and held a total monopoly on the Volga trade route. By the mid-10th century, its borders have collapsed inward. The tribute from the Viatici has just been severed. Its army relies heavily on mercenaries, and its capital, Itil, is a sprawling merchant hub, not a hardened military fortress. But it is still a massive state, with 2 capital cities, Itil on the Volga, and Sarkel on the Don, with a standing regular army, alliances with nomadic tribes, and staggering financial reserves. If Sveneld and Sviatoslav march in and get bogged down, the Khazars will grind them into dust, with the vast steppe and starvation in a single winter. Which means they cannot get bogged down. Which means one single fatal strike. The master plan they craft over the winter and execute in the summer of 965 works like this. Do not take the shortest route. March in a massive arc through the Vyatichy to the upper Volga, and from there down the river's current. Move with blinding speed. Ignore any fortress that can be bypassed. There is only one true target. It's ill. Once the capital falls, the rest of the empire will shatter on its own. And yet, inside this plan, Sarkel, located on the Don River, far to the west of the main invasion route, is somehow included, and it is hit first. Historians still debate this. Maybe Sarkel fell later, on the march back. Maybe Sviatoslav split his army, or maybe the Chronicles simply messed up the chronology. But in the Chronicle, the sequence is rigidly set. First Sarkel, then Itil. If this is the truth, then it is yet another decision that cannot possibly be explained by the hot-blooded impulse of a 20-year-old prince. Sarkel is the locked door on the western border of the Khaganate. As long as it stands, the Khazars can call for reinforcements from the western steppe, strike Kyiv from behind, and completely sever the Rus army's route home. By taking Sarkel first, the army secures its exit strategy no matter what happens on the Volga. This is not a strategy designed for glory. This is a strategy designed for survival. A 20-year-old general marching off to his first great war does not put thoughts of the escape route at the top of his list. A man who has survived 40 years of Kievan political assassinations and blood feuds puts it nowhere else. In April or May of 965, the Chronicle provides no exact date. The army of Sviatoslav and Sveneld begins its descent from the upper Volga, first westward to the Don to annihilate Sarkel, then back to the Volga and straight down toward the capital of the Khaganate. The prince leads, the voivode guides, and for the first time in 40 years, Sveneld is not marching to collect tribute, to pacify a rebellious tribe, or to besiege a minor wooden town. He is marching to tear down an empire, a real one, with two capitals, its own Khagan, its own army, and a 200-year history. If he succeeds, he will be the man who lived to see the death of Khazaria. If he fails, by the summer of 965, his body will be rotting in the Volga reeds, and no one back in Kyiv will ever know exactly where. From the upper Volga to Itil by water is roughly 2,000 versts, about 1,300 miles. For those who have never traveled down a river in a long ship, that is 2 months of steady travel with a favorable current, provided you don't stop for long. With stops, scouting missions, and minor skirmishes, it takes 3. Sviatoslav's army departs in the spring. They reach Itil in the middle of summer. 2 months on the water is a lot of time to truly learn about the man sitting in the boat with you. and a lot of time to figure out exactly who you are yourself. By the end of this journey, Sviatoslav is no longer the man who marched out of Kyiv. He has conquered the Viatici, wintered in hostile territory, made dozens of split-second tactical decisions, and won every single one of them. He begins to believe in himself with the terrifying absolute certainty of a man who has won repeatedly and never once tasted defeat. Sveneld sees this clearly, and, likely for the first time, he begins to realize that the student might one day stop taking orders. But for now, it is the summer of 965, and Itil lies dead ahead. Itil is not a capital in the European sense. It is essentially three cities standing side by side, divided by the winding branches of the Volga Delta. The first is an island in the middle, housing the palace of the Khagan. The Khagan is the supreme ruler, an almost sacral, godlike figure. Few ever see his face, and actual decisions are made by the Bek, the second in command. By the mid-10th century, this dual power structure is more of a ritual than a reality. The Bek governs, the Khagan is merely a symbol. The second city lies on the western bank. Here live the merchants, the craftsmen, the military garrison. Here are mosques, synagogues, churches. Itil is a deeply religiously diverse hub. The ruling elite of the Khaganate practices Judaism, while the common Khazars practice paganism and Islam, alongside vibrant Christian quarters. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, who visited the Volga half a century before Sviatoslav, describes Itil as a city where justice is divided among four religions: Jewish, Muslim, Christian, and pagan. Every man is judged by the laws of his own faith. The third city sits on the eastern bank, filled with the quarters of laborers and slaves. The permanent population of the city is estimated at up to 10,000. During the trading season, that number triples. Caravans from Central Asia arrive here, long ships from the Upper Volga, merchants from Khwarezm, Baghdad, and Byzantium. Here, furs are exchanged for silver, slaves for silk, wax for rare spices. The Khazar Khagan takes a 10% tithe on absolutely everything that passes through his customs gates. The entirety of the Volga trade is his. The entire route from north to south, from the Baltic to the Caspian Sea, passes through his fingers. And now imagine, in the summer of 965, an army approaches this city, an army that did not come to trade. Regarding the battle at Itil, the Russian chronicles contain exactly one sentence: "And there was a battle, and Sviatoslav overcame the Khazars and took their city and Beloberezhye." Beloberezhye is Sarkel, which either fell earlier or later, as the sources disagree. About the actual destruction of the capital, there is absolutely nothing else. Nothing about the numbers of troops, nothing about tactics, nothing about where the Rus stood or where the Khazars fell. But there is an Arab source, the geographer Ibn Hakal, who wrote in the 970s, just a few years after the events. He wasn't on the Volga himself, but he meticulously collected testimonies from merchants who were, and he describes the total annihilation of Itil without military tactical details, but with horrifying details of the aftermath. According to Ibn Hakal, Absolutely nothing was left of the city. Not a wall, not a house, not a mosque. There remained not a grape, nor a raisin, nor a leaf on a branch, is the literal quote.
The inhabitants were either slaughtered, dragged into slavery, or scattered entirely to the winds across the steppe. The Khagan fled to an island in the Caspian Sea, the Bektiid, or simply vanished. This is the language of an annihilation from which a state never recovers. Exactly how the Rus achieved this can only be reconstructed through indirect evidence. The Khazar army, it seems, marched out to meet them and was crushed in an open field. Then they entered the city, which could not defend itself without its army. Pillage, lasting for several agonizing days. Byzantine and Arab descriptions of similar events, and there were very few, as total annihilations like this were rare, make the mechanics perfectly clear. A professional army breaches a wealthy trading hub. They gather everything of extreme values: silver, gold, fabrics, weapons, slaves. They herd a massive chunk of the population into the longships, the ones who can be sold. They slaughter the rest, or let them run into the steppe. Then they bring the fire. It-Il is a wooden city built on islands in a river delta. It burns extremely fast. By the time the army leaves, there is nothing left but charred logs and ash, wet with morning dew. This is the absolute end of Khazaria as a state. Formally, the Khaganate will drag on for another half-century, clinging to islands and peripheral towns, but as the terrifying power that locked down the Volga and the steppe, it died in the summer of 965. The Chronicle has its version of the aftermath. Common sense has another. According to the Chronicle, Sviatoslav defeated the Khazars and took their cities. It is recorded as a triumph of the prince. The glory belongs to the prince. The name that will be remembered is the prince's. 1,000 years later, textbooks will read, Sviatoslav destroyed Khazaria, and this will technically be true. But let's look closely at what was actually carried out of it-Il. First, the silver. For 200 years, the Khazar Khaganate collected customs duties from all the trade on the Volga. The Arab dirham, flowing from south to north, dripped into the Khagan's treasury at a rate of 1/10 of every single caravan. Over 2 centuries, so many dirhams piled up in the cellars of it-Il that archaeologists to this day are unearthing their hoards across all of Eastern Europe, and a massive percentage of these hoards dates precisely to the second half of the 10th century, that immediately following the destruction. Second, the living cargo. Slaves, captured in the city and surrounding settlements. They are hauled up the Volga, the neither sold to the surviving Khazar merchants or dragged all the way back to Kyiv and down to Constantinople. The price of a slave in the 10th century ranges from half a dirham to several dirhams. 1,000 slaves equals thousands of dirhams of pure silver. Third, the goods sitting in the warehouses. Silk, spices, weapons, furs, wax, everything that had been stockpiled in it-Il for the upcoming trading season. All of this is loaded into the longships, dozens of longships. One portion returns with the prince to Kyiv, another goes to the warlord's fiefdoms, another is paid out to the rank-and-file retinue. Now the crucial point. The Chronicle says Sviatoslav took, but Sviatoslav is 24 years old.
He is a pure warrior. He does not keep accounting ledgers. He has no idea how many dirhams fit in a full chest, nor how many chests fit securely in a long ship. He does not sit down to haggle with the Arab merchants who trickle back after the slaughter merchants, who are no longer subjects of the Khagan, but subjects of the Prince of the Rus. Someone else is doing this for him. Sveneld in 965 is a man pushing 60, with 40 years of intimate experience handling tribute, polyudi, weighing scales, and longships. He doesn't fight in the front ranks anymore. He calculates and distributes. He doesn't take the glory, he takes the logistics. And now we return to the massive chests that stood in his Kievan Gridnitsa, Great Hall, before the campaign began. After Itil, there are vastly more of these chests. We don't know exactly how many. The sources do not provide an exact figure for Sveneld's personal cut from the Khazar campaign. But we know two things. First, 7 years later, in 972, when Sveneld returns from the Danube and stays on with Yaropolk, he will have enough silver to pay his own private army, completely independent of the princely treasury. Where he got this silver, the Chronicle doesn't explain. The answer almost certainly lies in the ashes of Itil. Second, that famous phrase from 945, Sveneld's men are adorned with weapons and fine clothes, becomes even more literal after 965. His men are not just armed and dressed better than the prince's retinue. They are dressed in the exact same wealth that had been piling up in the Khazar Khagan's vaults for 30 years. This is not theft. This is the absolute norm of the era. A voivode who leads a successful campaign takes a cut of the loot, larger than an ordinary warrior, smaller than the prince. But in Sveneld's case, smaller than the prince's is still a staggering fortune. Because the prince spends his cut on glory and more wars, while the voivode hoards it. In the autumn of 965, the army returns to Kyiv. The Chronicle is once again completely silent on the details. Nothing about the route likely up the Volga, then dragged overland to the Don, or a canothing about casualties. Nothing about how the loot was divided, just a dry statement of fact. Sviatoslav returned. Khazaria had fallen. In Kyiv, they winter for the first time in over a year. The retinue rests. Sviatoslav is a living legend. He is 24, and he has just shattered the empire that extorted tribute from his ancestors for centuries. In the eyes of his own warriors, he is no longer just Igor's son. He is the very archetype of the prince for whom the Varangians crossed the Baltic to settle on the Dnieper in the first place. Olga is still alive. He has 4 years left until her death. She looks at her son, returning with a staggering haul of silver and an even heavier burden of absolute self-confidence, and perhaps she realizes she can no longer hold him back. Not even in name. Sveneld, during this winter, is around 60. He has finally obtained what he spent his life quietly working toward. The first colossal influx of silver that allows him to live not just well, but with total independence. His chests can no longer hold his share. His young warriors no longer need a single coin from the prince's treasury. His retinue is a private army resting comfortably inside the greater army of Kyiv. It seems This is the perfect time to stop. But his student will not let him stop, because Sviatoslav is 24, and after Itil, a very simple thought has lodged itself in his brain, one formulated not by Sveneld, but by himself. If Khazaria fell to a single strike, then any empire can be taken with a single strike. That means he can march further, westward, to the Balkans, to the Danube, where the Bulgarian Empire stands weakened after 2 centuries of grinding wars with Byzantium. And beyond Bulgaria lies Constantinople, the city that neither Oleg nor Igor could crack. In 966, a brief campaign against the Viatici, who try to break away again after the fall of Khazaria, Sviatoslav violently drags them back into line. In 967, an embassy arrives from Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor Nikephoros Phocas offers pure silver if the Rus will strike Bulgaria. He wants to use Sviatoslav's hands to cripple his annoying Balkan neighbor. Sviatoslav takes the silver, and he marches. Sveneld goes with him, because the prince he raised no longer asks his voivode whether they should go or not. He merely asks what day they march out. The trap that Sveneld had been painstakingly building for the Rurikovich dynasty for 20 years begins to snap shut on himself. He has forged a prince whose will is stronger than his own. Now he must follow wherever the prince leads and hope to God he can find a way to survive it. And where Sviatoslav is leading them is not Itil. It is not a sprawling wooden merchant town in a river delta with no standing army. It is the Balkans. It is the Byzantine legions whom no Russian prince has ever managed to break. It is stone fortresses that even the Arabs failed to take. It is an empire that has fought on this specific theater of war for 200 years and knows every inch of it better than anyone alive. And Sveneld understands this perfectly, unlike his student. In the summer of 968, the Russian army, estimated by the Byzantines at roughly 60,000 men, though Kyiv's real capacity was closer to 10 or 15,000, reaches the Danube. This is utterly unprecedented. Before Sviatoslav, the Rus had never fought a land war in the Balkans. Oleg's campaign against Constantinople was entirely by sea. Igor's campaigns were too. But here, a massive army marches overland, straight through territories where they have no allied tribes, no familiar supply routes, and no fallback bases. Bulgaria in 968 is no longer the terrifying empire it was under Simeon a half-century earlier. Tsar Peter is an old, sick, deeply peaceful man. His army consists mostly of a peasant militia. Byzantium, with whom Bulgaria is formally allied, is in no rush to help, which is exactly why Nikephoros Phocas paid the Rus to attack them in the first place. Sviatoslav carves through Bulgaria exactly as he carved through Khazaria, fast, straightforward, without wasting time on minor strongholds. According to the Chronicle, he captures 80 cities along the Danube. The number is almost certainly symbolized. 80 in the Chronicle frequently just means a massive amount. But geographically, it is highly plausible. The Bulgarian bank of the Danube is studded with small fortified outposts, and an army marching down the river would indeed sweep them up one after another. The primary target is Pereiaslavets, a city in the Danube Delta, a vital commercial hub where ships arrive from the Black Sea and caravans depart deep into the Balkans. Sviatoslav takes Pereiaslavets in the autumn of 968, and then something happens that neither Sveneld nor Olga nor anyone else back in Kyiv ever anticipated. Sviatoslav stays in Pereiaslavets, not for the winter, not just to rest after the campaign. He stays forever. The Chronicle has preserved the exact phrase Sviatoslav utters, either in Pereiaslavets or shortly thereafter. The exact time and place are debated, but the phrase itself is documented in the primary chronicle, almost word for word. Here is a near literal translation. I do not like being in Kyiv. I want to live in Pereiaslavets on the Danube, for that is the center of my lands. That is where all good things flow. From the Greeks come gold, silks, wine, and various fruits. From the Czechs and Hungarians come silver and horses. From Rus come furs, wax, honey, and slaves. This is not a drunken toast. This is a monumental political declaration. He is saying, my land is no longer Kyiv. My land is the Danube. This is the center. Kyiv is just the freezing northern frontier, the place where the raw materials come from. The capital of my empire will be here. If you truly think about it, this is the most radical sentence spoken by a Russian prince in the entire 10th century. Rurik came from Novgorod to Ladoga. Oleg moved the capital from Novgorod to Kyiv. Sviatoslav is proposing to move it even further south, from Kyiv all the way to the Balkans. Every single step further south, closer to Constantinople, further away from the Slavic forest-covered north. If this plan becomes reality, Rus as an independent state with its capital in Kyiv ceases to exist. It is swallowed up as just another piece of the Balkan political sphere. With a completely different economy, a different religion, because the Balkans exist entirely in the Christian orbit of Constantinople, and within a generation, a different dynasty. In Kyiv, they hear this phrase, and they realize instantly what it means. Sveneld realizes it too, and probably for the first time in his entire life, he finds himself trapped in a position with no exit. He cannot actively support the prince, because Kyiv, the city where his court, his chests, and his personal retinue reside, would instantly be reduced to a miserable backwater province. He cannot actively oppose the prince, because Sviatoslav simply will not listen to him. And within the retinue, Sveneld now has the reputation of an aging man who has already been completely outplayed by the young wolf. He does what he always does when the waters are murky. He stays silent and waits. And right then, the Pechenegs intervene. In the spring of 969, while Sviatoslav sits comfortably in Pereiaslavets drafting blueprints for his new capital, the Pechenegs appear outside the walls of Kyiv. The Pechenegs are a confederation of Turkic nomadic tribes dominating the vast steppe between the Don and the Danube. For decades, they have constantly switched between being allies of Rus and being its deadliest enemies, entirely depending on who pays them more. In 965, they most likely aided Sviatoslav against the Khazars. It was highly profitable for them, as Khazaria was their ancient rival in the steppe. In 968, someone suddenly started paying them to strike in the opposite direction. Who exactly paid them, the Chronicle does not say out loud, but the geopolitical logic is blindingly clear. Byzantium, having sent Sviatoslav to crush the Bulgarians, suddenly realized that a Russian prince permanently camped on the Danube was infinitely worse than the Bulgarians ever were. He was entirely too close, and he had to be removed.
And to remove him, they had to force him to run back to Kyiv. The method was obvious: pay the steppe to show up at the walls of his capital. Inside Kyiv is the elderly Olga, sick, likely already bedridden. With her are 3 young grandsons, Yaropolk, Oleg, and Vladimir, aged roughly 7 to 10, and the city's ragtag militia, because the entire professional retinue is far away on the Danube. The Pechenegs surround the city. The crossings over the Dnieper are under constant archer fire. The wells outside the walls are in the hands of the steppe. Famine and agonizing thirst begin to grip Kyiv. The Chronicle preserves a scene that, while perhaps slightly romanticized, does not distort the core reality. A young boy from the city sneaks through the Pecheneg camp, speaking Pecheneg to pass as one of their own, reaches the Dnieper, swims across, and finds the Kievan voivode Pretich, who is camped with a tiny detachment on the left bank. Pretich, horrified to hear that Olga and the royal children are trapped in the city, executes a desperate bluff. He crosses the river with his handful of men and boldly announces to the Pecheneg Khan that he is merely the vanguard of Sviatoslav's returning massive army. The Khan falls for it. The steppe horde pulls back. This saves the city, but it does not change the core truth. Olga, dying, sends a direct, unvarnished message to her son on the Danube. According to the Chronicle, it is incredibly harsh. You, prince, seek and guard foreign lands, while you have abandoned your own. The Pechenegs nearly took us, and your mother, and your children. If you do not come, if you do not protect us, they will take us. Do you have no pity for your own homeland, nor for your old mother, nor for your own children? This is the single direct quote from Olga across her entire regency that the Chronicle bothered to preserve, and it is a stinging rebuke that Sviatoslav simply cannot brush aside. He returns to Kyiv. Sviatoslav arrives in Kyiv in the summer of 969. The Pechenegs have already vanished by this point, whether chased off by Pretich's bluff, paid to leave, or simply because they deemed a prolonged siege pointless. The sources disagree. But the prince doesn't return to a besieged city. He returns to his dying mother, who begs him for only one thing: to stay. Olga dies in the autumn of 969. The Chronicle gives a specific date, July 11th, but the exact day is disputed and other readings exist. What truly matters is this:
She dies already knowing with absolute certainty that her son will not listen to her. She extracts a promise for just one thing: to be buried according to Christian rites, without a pagan feast, without burial mounds, without human sacrifices. Sviatoslav fulfills this final promise. Very few people were buried by Christian rites in the fiercely pagan Kyiv of 969. And from the princely dynasty, she is the very first. For exactly 3 days after the funeral, Sviatoslav sits in Kyiv. Then he spends a few weeks dividing up the realm. He seats his eldest son, Yaropolk, on the Kievan throne. The middle son, Oleg, is sent to the Derevlian lands. The youngest, Vladimir, born to a housekeeper named Malushais, dispatched to Novgorod, entirely at the request of the Novgorodians themselves, who found themselves without a prince. And then he marches straight back to the Danube. This is the defining decision of his entire life, and he makes it mere weeks after burying his mother. The state is fractured among 3 young boys. The capital has been relocated to Pereiaslavets. The prince himself, over 40 years old, commanding the absolute core of the army, returns to bleed for the Balkans. Sveneld marches right alongside him. He also had a choice. He could have stayed in Kyiv, standing over the young Yaropolk, in the role of the supreme elder statesman. His age, his experience, his heavy chest, everything practically demanded it. Yaropolk is an 11 or 12-year-old boy in desperate need of a guardian. There is no better guardian in all of Kyiv in 969 than Sveneld. He does not stay. Why, the Chronicle never explains, but the brutal logic is visible. If Sveneld stays in Kyiv with Yaropolk, no, he completely loses everything he has spent 25 years building. His absolute control over Sviatoslav, his central place in the primary princely army, his massive share of the military loot, which on the Danube promises to dwarf what he took in Khazaria. Because this isn't about some wooden trading town. This is about the rich Christian empires of the Balkans with their massive cathedrals, monasteries, and royal treasuries. There is a second, even more terrifyingly pragmatic reason. Sviatoslav, left alone on the Danube, without Sveneldus, a Sviatoslav who will lose. The voivode sees this clearly after the first Bulgarian campaign. The prince is marching against an enemy he does not fully understand, in a landscape he cannot read, with an army completely unsuited for a grinding, long-term Balkan war. Without Sveneld standing next to him, Sviatoslav will be in the ground within a year. And if he goes into the grounds, so does the vast majority of the professional retinue, the very foundation of all Kievan military power. And without that army, the silver piled in Sveneld's chests loses half its value. Because silver, without swords to protect it, is just heavy metal. Which means to the Danube, with a student who can no longer be leashed, into a war he never chose to fight. In the autumn of 969, the Russian army marches south once again. The majority of the top warlords are with the prince. Among them is Sveneld. He is pushing 65. By age and by sheer common sense, this should absolutely be his final grand campaign. He doesn't know it yet, but ahead lies Derevlian, a fortress on the Danube where the Russian army will be trapped in a brutal 3-month siege, forced to eat horse flesh and die of starvation, where Sviatoslav will lose a battle for the first time in his life and finally realize he has lost the war. Where Sveneld, for the very first time in 40 years, will reach into his own chest not to put silver in, but to take it out, to pay the mercenaries who survived, because there simply won't be any other money left in the besieged, starving city.
And where both of them, the prince and the voivode, will make a final decision that will separate them forever. But that is still a year away, for now it is the autumn of 969. A cold wind blows off the Danube, and the army is on the march. The old Varangian is riding into his last great war, and for the first time in his entire life, he isn't going purely out of cold calculation, but because he simply has no other choice left.
In the autumn of 969, Sviatoslav returns to Pereiaslavets and discovers that during his year-long absence, everything has completely changed. The Bulgarians, whom he arrogantly considered completely crushed, have risen in open rebellion. Pereiaslavets had to be taken by force all over again, and this time with heavy casualties. Tsar Peter has died, and his son Boris now sits on the throne. Young, indecisive, but no longer totally defenseless. Backing him is a faction of Bulgarian nobility that absolutely despises the Rus. But vastly more important, there is a new emperor in Constantinople. In December 969, Nikiforos Phokas was brutally stabbed to death in his own bedroom. A classic Byzantine plot, a conspiracy, a lover, assassins hiding under the bed. The man who takes the throne is his murderer, John Tzimiskes. Short, thoroughly unremarkable to look at, with stubby legs, and undeniably one of the most brilliant military commanders Byzantium produced in the entire 10th century.
This changes absolutely everything. Nikiforos had previously paid the Rus to attack the Bulgarians because he simply had no time. He was heavily bogged down fighting the Arabs in the east. Tzimiskes signs a peace treaty with the Arabs in 970 and pivots his full attention to the Balkans. And there he finds a massive Russian army that has been sitting on the banks of the Danube for 2 years, capturing cities, extorting tribute from the Bulgarians, and clearly showing zero intention of ever leaving. Tzimiskes sends an embassy to Sviatoslav, offering him gold if he will just pack up and leave. A lot of gold. Sviatoslav flatly refuses. Furthermore, according to the Chronicle, he sends an incredibly arrogant counteroffer. Tell the Byzantines to abandon their European provinces entirely, hand everything up to Constantinople, over to the Rus, or else he will come and take it himself. This might just be the chronicler's dramatic rhetoric, but the historical fact remains. In the spring of 970, the Russian army begins a massive march south, pouring through the mountain passes of the Balkans, heading straight for Byzantine territory. Sveneld marches right alongside them, and dreading between the lines, he realizes that his student has finally crossed the point of no return. Up until this exact moment, every single one of Sviatoslav's wars had been against a weaker opponent. The Viatici, isolated forest tributaries; Khazaria, a hollowed-out trading state with a mercenary army; Bulgarian, exhausted, decaying kingdom. Now it's completely different.
Now he is facing an empire with a 1,000-year unbroken military tradition, the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, a terrifying naval fleet, an impenetrable network of fortresses, and Greek fire. The exact same empire beneath whose walls Igor's fleet had been reduced to ashes. The old voivode remembers all of this personally. He was quite possibly standing on those very burning longships in 941. And now his student is leading an army the exact same Varangian Slavic composition straight back into that exact same meat grinder, only this time by land. In the spring of 970, the Rus pour down from the Balkan mountains and crash into the Byzantine army somewhere near Arcadiopolis, a city in Thrace, just a few days' march from Constantinople. The Russian Chronicle enthusiastically describes this battle as a crushing victory for Sviatoslav. The Byzantine Chronicle, written by Leo the Deacon, describes it as a decisive victory for Bardas Skleros, Tzimiska's top general. The absolute truth, as usual, lies somewhere in the middle. The Rus inflicted horrendous casualties on the Byzantines, but their advance was completely shattered and they rolled back into Bulgaria. For an offensive campaign, this is a catastrophic failure. For a defensive action, it is a success. But something far more important happened here. At Arcadiopolis, Sveneld sees up close, for the very first time, exactly how the Byzantine military machine operates.
This is not a chaotic Varangian shield wall,
Not a disorganized Pecheneg cavalry swarm, not a terrified Bulgarian peasant militia. This is an absolute system. In the center, heavy infantry, the skautatoi, armed with long spears and massive shields, standing in disciplined ranks. On the flanks, the cataphracts, super-heavy cavalry, both man and horse, entirely encased in armor, charging in a devastating wedge formation. Behind the lines, archers and slingers raining death in high arcs. And commanding all of this are not screaming warlords at the front, but calm officers using flags and horns to relay precise signals from the general. The traditional Russian tactics against an army like this are practically useless. The Varangian shield wall easily breaks a Slavic militia and crushes Khazar infantry. But against the skautatoi, it smashes into a wall of spears and cannot advance an inch. The cataphracts effortlessly sweep around the flanks and chop them to pieces. Sveneld sees all of this, and, in all likelihood, it is immediately after Arcadiopolis that he tells Sviatoslav the exact thing the prince absolutely refuses to hear. You cannot win this war in an open field. The only option left is to lock yourself in the fortresses and pray the enemy's patience runs out before your food does. Sviatoslav agrees, not because he actually listened to the advice, but because he literally has no other choice. He has nothing left to launch an offensive with. In the summer of 970, the Russian army retreats to the banks of the Danube and locks itself inside the Bulgarian fortresses. The primary stronghold is Dorostelon, modern-day Silistra, sitting right on the border of Bulgaria and Romania. Thick walls, a heavy garrison, strong stockpiles, a place where you can hold out for a very long time. At least, that is what Sviatoslav hopes. Tzimiskes has entirely different plans.
In the spring of 971, the Byzantine army crosses the Balkan mountains, marching straight through the very passes that Sviatoslav had left completely unguarded, apparently assuming they were impassable for a massive army in the early spring. Tzimiskes shatters that assumption. He forces the army through the mountains before the snow has even melted, and bursts out right at Great Preslav, the Bulgarian capital, where a massive chunk of the Russian garrison is stationed. Preslav is stormed and taken in just 2 days. The Russian garrison is almost entirely slaughtered. The Bulgarian Tsar Boris, who had been held there under Russian protection, is captured and shipped straight to Constantinople. This is an unmitigated disaster. The Russian army in Bulgaria is now completely severed. The main forces with Sviatoslav are trapped in Dorostelon, while the reserves and the entire rear guard are now under Tzimiskes' total control. In April 971, the Byzantine army arrives at the walls of Dorostelon. The siege begins, and it will drag on for 3 agonizing months. We know exactly what this looked like, not from the Russian Chronicles, which summarize everything incredibly briefly and paint it as a heroic Russian triumph, but from Leo the Deacon, who wrote his account just a few years later, relying heavily on eyewitness testimony. It is even possible he was personally present during the final negotiations, though this remains debated. According to Leo the Deacon, the siege is not one single glorious assault or one grand battle. It is 3 solid months of grueling, soul-crushing attrition. Tzimiskes does not throw his men at the walls. He simply surrounds the fortress, chokes off the Danube with his terrifying fleet, armed with Greek fire, builds a fortified camp around them, and waits. Time is completely on his side. Inside Dorostelon are thousands of Rus who must eat every single day. Out in the field around Dorostelon is the Byzantine army, comfortably fed by the vast resources of the entire empire. The Rus launch several desperate sallies. Some are highly successful and inflict brutal casualties. But every single sally costs men who cannot possibly be replaced. Every single clash slowly bleeds the garrison dry. Inside the fortress, we see exactly what military historians call a siege economy. The price of bread explodes. Then the bread completely runs out. They begin slaughtering the horses for meat. Then the price of horse meat, according to Leo the Deacon, hits half a grivna per horse's head. Half a grivna of pure silver is, roughly speaking, the entire monthly salary of an average warrior, for a severed head, for an animal that was once a priceless war horse worth 100 times that. Leo the Deacon describes another scene that is entirely missing from the Russian Chronicles. At night, after a particularly brutal day of fighting, the Rus carry the bodies of their dead down to the banks of the Danube and burn them. Along with the bodies, they throw sacrifices into the dark water, roosters, infants, and prisoners of war. This is a horrific pagan funeral rite, a final desperate attempt to appease gods who have clearly turned their backs. If this scene is true, and it is highly believable because desperate pagans frequently revert to the most archaic and bloody forms of ritual,
Then it reveals exactly what Sviatoslav's army had been reduced to by the summer of 971.
This is no longer the proud, terrifying war machine that burned Itil to the ground. These are starving men sacrificing children to Perun on the muddy banks of the Danube because there is absolutely nothing left to believe in. Where is Sveneld in this apocalyptic nightmare? The Chronicle doesn't mention him by name, but sheer logic does. The payments to the mercenaries inside the starving city do not stop. If they did, the Varangians would instantly defect to the besiegers, as frequently happened. That means someone is still paying them. Sviatoslav's treasury inside Dorostelon is practically empty. The bulk of his silver was either left in Pereiaslavets or shipped back to Kyiv. But Sveneld's personal chests, dragged all the way to the Danube, are full. This is the very first time in 40 years that the old voivode reaches his hand into his own personal chests, not to drop silver in, but to take it out.
He is spending his own fortune to keep his own mutinous army in line inside a doomed fortress, sitting right next to the prince he personally raised to be too arrogant to ever take advice. His chests probably didn't empty completely, but for the very first time he looks into them and realizes a terrifying truth. They are finite. At the end of July 971, Sviatoslav finally does what he had been avoiding for 2 months. He marches out of Dorostelon and offers Tzimiskes a decisive grand battle in the open field. According to Leo the Deacon, this battle is one of the most savage and horrific clashes in the entire history of 10th century Byzantine warfare. The Rus fight, as the Greek describes it, with the fury of absolute despair. The Varangian shield wall charges again and again, slamming into the Byzantine formations, hacking wildly and falling back. The cataphracts counterattack ruthlessly. By nightfall, the field is choked with mountains of corpses from both sides. According to the Russian Chronicle, Sviatoslav won a glorious victory. According to Leo the Deacon, the Rus barely managed to crawl back behind the walls of the fortress, having taken casualties so catastrophic they simply could not continue the war. The truth, as is always the case between these two sources, leans heavily toward the Greek. Just a few days later, Sviatoslav begs for peace. Tzimiskes agrees, not out of a sudden burst of Christian mercy, but out of cold calculation. To storm Dorostelon head-on would mean sacrificing half his army on the walls. To keep waiting carries the risk that the Rus might somehow break out and vanish into the steppe, and hunting them down in the wild grasses would take an eternity. A negotiated peace is far cheaper. The terms are absolute. The Rus must abandon Bulgaria entirely, swear an oath never to wage war against Byzantium again, and formally renounce all claims to any territories along the Danube. In return, Tzimiskes grants them safe passage, provisions for the brutally long journey home, and the restoration of their old trading privileges in Constantinople. Sviatoslav is personally guaranteed a safe exit with his surviving army and longships back to Rus. And then the famous meeting takes place. Leo the deacon describes it as an eyewitness, or based directly on the words of an eyewitness, and this is the only time in Russian history, prior to Yaroslav the Wise, that a foreign contemporary leaves a detailed physical portrait of a Russian prince. The meeting takes place on the muddy banks of the Danube. Tzimiskes rides up, surrounded by a glittering retinue, clad in golden armor, sitting atop a magnificent white horse. Sviatoslav arrives in a longship, rowing the oars right alongside his men, distinguishable from them only by one thing: his clothes are slightly cleaner. He is a man of medium height, powerfully built, broad-shouldered, with a completely shaved head, save for one long lock of hair falling on one side, drooping mustaches, and in one ear a gold earring with 2 pearls and a ruby in the center. He barely speaks. His expression, according to the deacon, is gloomy and savage. The 2 commanders speak briefly.
What exactly they say, the Greek does not record. Then they part ways, each returning to his own men. The peace treaty is signed. The war is officially over. The Russian army that marches out of Dorostalon numbers, according to various wildly differing estimates, between 8 and 22,000 men. When they arrived in the spring of 970, there were vastly more. How many thousands were left rotting in the earth outside Dorostalon, under the walls of Arkadiopolis, or drowning in the swamps of Preslavno, nobody bothered to count. Sveneld is still alive among this battered, starving mass, but he is probably realizing, for the first time in his life, that his grand calculation failed completely. He came to the Danube with the prince just to ensure he didn't lose his privileged place beside him. But he has lost everything anyway: his silver, his men, and, it seems, the prince himself. Because the Sviatoslav, sitting in that longship for the journey home, is not the same man who sat in Pereiaslavets in the autumn of 968. His face is gaunt. He speaks in clipped sentences. He lost a massive war, was forced to publicly admit it with a treaty, and now he is 28 years old, crawling back to Kyiv with absolutely nothing left but his own crushing shame. And between Dorostalon and Kyiv lies the Dnieper River, and on the Dnieper rear the rapids, and waiting at those rapids are the Pechenegs, who, under the strict terms of the treaty with Tzimiskes, were supposed to let the Rus pass unharmed. Tzimiskes had promised to send them a formal notification. Whether he actually kept this promise or not will remain the subject of vicious historical debate for the next 1,000 years. Sveneld highly doubts this promise, and he is absolutely right to do so. The journey back from Dorostalon is not a triumph. It is a desperate retreat. But the army doesn't march in silence. Along the way, somewhere in the vast expanse between the Danube and the Dnieper rapids, Sveneld and Sviatoslav have a quiet conversation about the route. Just one short, purely practical conversation. Take horses through the open steppe, or drag the longships up the river. 2 routes. One belongs to the voivode, the other to the prince. They will not agree. And right at this exact crossroads, for the first time in 25 years, the old Varangian will do something he has never, ever done before. He will abandon his student entirely. The army marches north from the Danube,
Overland to the mouth of the Dnieper takes several weeks of brutal marching across the vast steppe, which the Rus simply call the wild fields. From there they row upstream, fighting the heavy current, and right in the middle of this torturous journey lie the Dnieper rapids. The rapids are not a metaphor. They are 9 massive jagged ridges of stone, completely blocking the Dnieper for nearly 70 versts, about 45 miles, roughly between modern-day Dnipro and Zaporozhye. The most terrifying of them all is Nenasyietets, the insatiable, which lets the rushing water pass, but completely destroys any longship that tries to ride it. There you have to pull to the bank, unload the ships, drag the heavy wooden hulls overland through the mud and rocks by sheer physical force, and then slide them back into the water. Every single rapid takes a full day, sometimes 2. And during this entire agonizing process, the army is stretched out helplessly along the riverbank for miles, completely stripped of its battle formation, exhausted by grinding physical labor. It is the absolute perfect place for an ambush. The steppe knows this perfectly well. Constantine Porphyrogenitus, the Byzantine emperor who wrote a textbook on statecraft for his son, explicitly described these exact rapids half a century before Sviatoslav in his treatise De Administrando Imperio. Here the Rus come ashore, here the Pechenegs wait for them, and here they die. Sveneld knows this just as well. Due to his vast age and experience, he knows it better than anyone else alive in that army. The Chronicle records a scene that we can confidently accept as historical truth, for one very simple reason. It doesn't make either side look good. A Russian chronicler who deeply sympathizes with Sviatoslav would have absolutely no motive to invent a fake conversation where the heroic prince makes a fatally stupid mistake, while the cautious voivode gives the correct advice. According to the Chronicle, Sveneld tells the prince, "Bypass the rapids on horses, prince, for the Pechenegs are waiting at the rapids." Sviatoslav flatly refuses. The Chronicle doesn't bother to explain the reasons for his refusal. We can guess several. First, he has longships loaded down with the remaining loot and the severely wounded. To abandon the ships and ride light means throwing away a massive chunk of his army. Second, the steppe route is still Pecheneg territory. Cavalry in the open grass is just as vulnerable to ambush as infantry at the rapids. Third, and perhaps most crucially, after the utter humiliation at Derevlian, he refuses to show weakness. To smash his way through the rapids is still the act of a warrior. To sneak around them through the steppe is an open admission that he is crawling home like a thief in the night. Sviatoslav chooses the rapids. Sveneld chooses the steppe. We need to pause right here, because everything that happened earlier in this entire story has been building toward this exact moment, and everything that will happen after will be born from it. The voivode and the prince split the army. Sveneld takes the cavalry, his Varangians, and a loyal chunk of the retinue, and rides off into the steppe, heading north, completely bypassing the rapids. Sviatoslav remains behind with the infantry, the longships,
the heavy loot, and the wounded. He begins the slow, doomed descent toward the churning water. According to the primary chronicle, this was merely a practical, logistical decision. According to the brutal reality of what is actually happening, this is a divorce from which there is absolutely no coming back. We do not know if there was a final, bitter conversation between them. We do not know if they looked each other in the eye. We do not know if the arrogant student bothered to say goodbye to the old men who raised him from a 3-year-old boy.
The Chronicle completely omits this scene, perhaps because it never actually happened. Perhaps everything was decided with a single gesture. The voivode turned his horse away, while the prince stayed by the water. If you truly think about it, this is the most honest thing Sveneld has done his entire life. His whole career was built on choosing the shadows, staying silent, playing the indirect game. Here, he makes his choice openly. He gathers his men, secures his heavy chests of silver, and walks away. He doesn't stage a loud mutiny. He doesn't scream that the prince is leading them all to their deaths. He simply takes a different road. And in this singular choice, his entire formula for survival is perfectly encapsulated in one motion. The prince is a target. The voivode is the man who knows exactly when to walk away the second the target becomes too bright. The Chronicle does not explain Sveneld's inner motive. It doesn't write that the voivode knew for a fact there was an ambush and abandoned the prince purely to save his own skin. It just dryly records, he left via the steppe, the prince stayed at the rapids. Everything else is our interpretation, heavily based on observing his previous 40 years. Maybe the truth is actually simpler. He was old and cautious. The prince was young and incredibly stubborn. They had a heated disagreement over tactics, and only later, in hindsight, did this split look like a master stroke of cold calculation. But even if it was pure accident, it is an accident that perfectly mirrors his entire biography. Sviatoslav and his half of the army reached the rapids at the beginning of the winter of 971,972, and quickly discover that passing them is physically impossible. The Chronicle explains this in one terrifying sentence. Kurya, the Pecheneg prince, did not let them pass. Kurya is the dominant Pecheneg Khan controlling the entire steppe around the rapids. According to one version, pushed heavily by Byzantine authors, Tzimiskes did actually send the promised notification to the Pechenegs, but the message may have contained a subtle hint. The Rus are crawling home with loot, exhausted from a devastating war, weakened, and if the steppe happens to slaughter them, absolutely no one in Constantinople will shed a tear. According to another version, Tzimiskes sent nothing at all, and the rumor of a crippled Russian army crawling up the river simply reached the Pechenegs on its own, which, in the steppe, happens instantly. Regardless of how they knew, the rapids are completely blocked. Going forward means death. Going backward to Bulgaria also means death, because the Byzantines are already there. Sviatoslav falls back to set up a winter camp. The location the Chronicle calls Beloberezhye, the White Shores, is, according to modern historians, the area near the mouth of the Dnieper, right where the river flows into the estuary before hitting the Black Sea. It is a bleak, flat coast of reeds and salt marshes. In winter, it is blasted by freezing winds sweeping off the steppe. There is zero shelter. There are no provisions, and no reinforcements are coming. The winter of 971-972 in Beloberezhye is an event the chronicler summarizes with what might be the most horrifying single line in the entire text. And there was a great famine, such that a horse's head cost half a grivna. During this frozen winter, Sviatoslav loses the vast majority of the army he still had left in the autumn. Some die of sheer starvation, some from the wounds they took outside Derevlian that simply wouldn't heal. Some freeze to death. By the spring of 972, he is left with, according to various estimates, a few hundred men, maybe 1,500 at most. The pitiful, walking remnants of the massive war machine that had marched on the Danube 3 years prior. In the spring, he desperately marches on the rapids again. To wait any longer is impossible. The slow death of starvation in Beloberezhye is now far scarier than any ambush waiting ahead. The ambush happens, exactly where Sveneld warned it would 6 months earlier. At Ninasi Tetsor, one of the neighboring rapids, the exact location is debated, Kurya and his riders surround the Rus at the exact moment they are dragging the heavy longships overland. There is no real battle. The Rus are stretched thin, hollowed out by famine, and completely incapable of forming a shield wall. The Pechenegs are mounted on fresh horses, with the entire open steppe at their backs. Sviatoslav dies right there on the rocks, along with almost every single man left in his retinue. The Chronicle adds a detail that is impossible to verify, but far too vivid to be an outright invention by the chronicler. The Pecheneg Khan Kurya, the Chronicle states, took Sviatoslav's skull and had it made into a drinking cup, bound in silver, and drank from it at feasts. This custom actually did exist among steppe nomads, recorded across various tribes from the Scythians to the Cumans. To drink from the skull of an enemy means to absorb his power, and at the same time to show everyone exactly who he was. The prince who, just 4 years earlier, seriously planned to move the capital of Rus to the Danube, had by the spring of 972 become a silver-bound cup in the hands of a Pecheneg Khan, and Sveneld sitting safely in Kyiv. The exact date of his return is not provided by the Chronicle, but logic dictates he reached the city in the winter of 971-972, well before Sviatoslav was slaughtered, meaning that at the exact moment the prince is starving to death in the frozen mud of Beloberezhye, old voivode is already warming himself in the Kievan Great Hall, alive, surrounded by his cavalry, with his heavy chests intact, having not lost a single one of his Varangian warriors. In Kyiv sits the 13-year-old Yaropolk, the nominal prince. He has guardians. Who exactly they are, the Chronicle does not specify, but practically the most powerful man in the city from the winter of 971-972 onward is undeniably Sveneld. He is the only major warlord who made it back alive, the only man who still commands a private army, the only man who remembers exactly how the state actually functions, because he watched it function under Igor, under Olga, and under Sviatoslav.
The news of Sviatoslav's brutal death reaches Kyiv in the spring or summer of 972. How the news was received, the Chronicle doesn't bother to record, but we can easily imagine. 13-year-old Yaropolk becomes the real prince for the very first time in his life, no longer just a placeholder. He has two younger brothers sitting in their own lands, Oleg in the Derevlian lands, Vladimir in Novgorod, a state treasury completely drained by the catastrophic Danube War, a retinue that has shrunk to a fraction of its former size, and exactly one old, hardened voivode standing right next to him, telling him what to do. Sveneld, this spring, is pushing 65. He has survived Igor, Olga, and Sviatoslav. He managed to save his army, his capital, and his own skin. And for the very first time in 30 years, he isn't merely standing next to the throne, he is effectively sitting on it, governing through the boy. This is his absolute peak. He does not yet know that this is exactly where his downfall begins, because there is one crucial detail he completely forgot to include in his flawless calculations. He has a son, Liut, a grown man, wildly arrogant, who has absolutely no concept of danger because he has spent his entire life shielded by his father's terrifying shadow. And in 3 years, this son will decide he wants to go hunting in someone else's woods. But until then, there are 3 years of total prosperity. 3 years where Sveneld runs the entire state from over the shoulder of a boy prince, convinced he has finally cracked the ultimate formula for absolute safety. He had saved the army, the chests, and himself. All he had to do was save his son, and it is exactly here that he will make his fatal mistake. Formally, Yaropolk has been the prince since the exact moment of his father's death. He is 13. By the Russian customs of the 10th century, this is already a fully recognized coming of age. A boy of 13 is officially a man, fully entitled to sit on the throne, make decisions, and seal treaties. Formally, there is no designated regent standing over him, but there is the court, there is the council of elders, there is the voivode, whom everyone addresses purely by his first name, without a patronymics, simply Sveneld, in the exact same way that in the 1390s people will say the boyar, without needing to clarify which one, because you don't need to clarify. In Kyiv, there is only one Sveneld. Here is how this works in practice. Yaropolk issues the decrees, but the decrees are merely the conclusion of a debate that took place the night before in the council. In the council, the loudest and most decisive voice is Sveneld's. He knows the exact prices for tribute. He knows the names of the Pecheneg Khans. He knows exactly which merchants just arrived from Constantinople and exactly what they are willing to pay for wax. He knows absolutely everything. The young prince knows almost nothing. In a structure like this, formal titles mean absolutely nothing. What actually matters is competence and habit. Yaropolk develops the habit of asking. He asks about absolutely everything, from the trivial to the monumental. What percentage to extract from the Derevlian tribute? Who should lead the expedition to the Sviatoslav? Whether to accept the embassy from Hungary?
whether to marry off one of his sisters left behind by Olga to the German ambassador. And Sveneld provides the answers. This is the absolute perfect structure for shadow power. It possesses one unique quality which Sveneld sees far more clearly than historians will 1,000 years later.
A setup like this does not require treason, a broken oath, or a stolen crown. It requires exactly one thing: that the young prince continues to get used to the fact that an older man is doing his thinking for him. As long as this habit holds, the power belongs to the older man. The second the habit breaks, the power vanishes in a single day, without a battle, without a conspiracy, without a drop of blood. Sveneld understands this completely, and that is why, for 3 years, he works not so much for the benefit of the state, but to preserve this exact habit. He carefully isolates the young prince from any other advisors. Not brutally, not through exile or midnight assassinations, but simply by ensuring he is always there first, standing right next to the prince, with a fully prepared answer while the others are still pondering. At the feast, he sits right beside him. At the council, he arrives early. On the poliudi, he rides out personally and brings Yaropolk along. This is his quiet method, not to rule the state openly, but to keep the prince in a comfortable, padded position where the prince finds it deeply convenient not to rule it himself. Up until now, we have only seen Sveneld standing against the backdrop of princely events. But he has his own court, his own towering timber mansion, his own servants, his own hitching posts, his own private retinue, living in separate cabins, built entirely around his estate. Where exactly this massive court stood in Kyiv is unknown. Indirect evidence points to the part of the citadel closest to the Podil, bustling merchant district. It's a wealthy spot, but deliberately not right in the dead center of the prince's fortress. Set slightly off to the side, exactly where a shadow belongs. What it looks like inside, we can reliably reconstruct from 10th century archaeology. The main gridnitsa, the Great Hall, is a long room with a hearth burning in the center, a heavy wooden floor, and walls draped in thick fabric to block the drafts. Along the walls are long wooden benches where the retinue sits during feasts. At the far end, a raised platform, and on it, the high seat of the master. On the wall behind his back hang his weapons, his shields, and his trophies from decades of campaigns. A Khazar helmet, a Byzantine spear, a curved Bulgarian saber. Behind Sveneld's back, in all likelihood, all of these things are hanging. He marched on Itil. He survived the hell of Derastalan. He saw the towering walls of Constantinople from the shore. For every single wara piece of iron on the wall, and lined up along the other wall are the heavy chests. He doesn't hide them. A Varangian boyar's chests in the 10th century are not a secret stash. They are an open display of terrifying power. They sit in plain sight, massive, bound in thick iron, locked tight. When silver is needed to pay the mercenaries, a servant walks over and scoops it out right in front of everyone. When a guest arrives, the chests are the first thing they see. It is a flex of absolute status. By 975, Sveneld has many of these chests. Exactly how many, we do not know, but enough to continuously pay his private army
of 300 Varangians without ever asking the prince's treasury for a single coin. Enough to maintain his massive court, his servants, his war horses, his longships moored at the docks. Enough to instantly hire 300 more Varangians from across the sea, from Novgorod, from anywhere he wants, should the need arise. Inside these chests lies 40 years of tribute from the Derevlians and Uliks, his cut of the Khazar loot, the spoils from the Danube taken before Dorostelon, the lavish gifts presented by Byzantine ambassadors, silver in dirhams, gold in solidi, precious silks, Byzantine fabrics literally worth their weight in gold, weapons, swords, spears, chainmail stacked in reserve. And there is Liut. His son lives in this exact same mansion. In 975, he is roughly 20 years old, maybe slightly older. The Chronicle gives no exact age. He grew up in this great hall, entirely surrounded by the iron chests and the weapons on the wall, completely shielded under the wing of a father who always, without fail, resolved every single problem for him. Liut is a boyar's son from the moment he drew breath. He has his own purebred horses, his own hunting falcons, his own personal servants. His father's lethal retinue are our boys. Kyiv is ours. The surrounding lands are ours. What not ours means she doesn't really understand. His father always took care of it. There is one specific thing that Sveneld, sitting at the absolute peak of his power, completely loses sight of. And this is astonishing, because his entire career has been a masterclass in seeing exactly what others fail to notice. He loses sight of Yaropolk's younger brothers. There are two of them, and they are far away from Kyiv. Olegin, the Derevlian land, sitting in Ovruch. Vladimirin, Novgorod. Both were installed there by Sviatoslav right before his final campaign in 969. Both were roughly 10 or 12 years old at the time. Now, in 975, both are 15 or 17. To Sveneld, they are still children, little boys sitting in the muddy provinces with no serious retinue to their names, appearing in Kievan calculations purely as the recipients of a predetermined cut of the national tribute. In reality, Oleg is not sitting alone in Ovruch. Standing right behind him is the Derevlian nobility, the exact families that somehow survived the brutal massacre of 946. Their children and grandchildren, people for whom the name Sveneld means exactly one thing: the warlord who squeezed tribute out of them for 30 years and then, in 946, helped Olga butcher their parents and grandfathers. The Derevlian nobility never forgot this, but for 30 years they kept their mouths shut because there was no one to speak to. Now there is. Now they have their very own prince, the 15-year-old Oleg, son of Sviatoslav, and they whisper directly into his ear, telling him exactly who in Kiev he should truly hate. This is one lethal thread that Sveneld fails to see. The second is Novgorod. Vladimir has been sitting there for nearly a decade, steadily gathering his own people, his own Varangians, real ones, straight from across the Baltic Sea, from Scandinavia, because Novgorod is a port city, and the long ships arrive constantly. Vladimir is not Sviatoslav. He doesn't crave a massive, glorious war. He quietly stockpiles resources. He is a predator of an entirely new generation, the kind of man who, in 30 years, will look back at Sveneld's petty political intrigues as outdated, clumsy amateur hour. Sveneld notices none of this. Looking from Kyiv, Novgorod is just the edge of the map, a tributary, a city that pays its taxes and stays quiet. Between Kyiv and Ovruchit is a 2 or 3 day ride. Between Kyiv and Novgorod takes 2 weeks. By the time news travels there and an answer comes back, you can accomplish an awful lot.
And so, in 975, deep in the forests near Ovruch, something happens that Sveneld also completely failed to foresee, because it isn't politics. It's a hunt. Liud Sveneldik rides out to hunt in 975. Where exactly, the Chronicle writes very briefly, chasing a beast in the forest. Somewhere right on the vague border between Kievan and Derevlian lands, northwest of the capital. For a young, arrogant boyar, this is a completely standard affair. An autumn hunt for big game is a display of both entertainment and raw status. With him are his own men, trackers, hunting dogs, falcons, everything appropriate for a man of his high station. The longer he rides, the deeper into the forest he goes. The hounds drive the beast leads them further in. That is exactly how a hunt works. You follow the prey, not looking at where the borders lie. But there is a border, and he crosses it. He rides straight into the forests that legally belong to Oleg the Derevlian. This is not a simple accident that can be brushed off as the heat of the chase. This is a blatant, arrogant gesture, because Liud absolutely knows whose woods these are. He couldn't possibly not know he's 20 years old, raised in a house where the exact map of the state's tribute fiefdoms is recited like a prayer. And he rides into a place where the son of a Kievan boyar has absolutely no right to be without the explicit permission of the local prince. He rides in because he is absolutely certain there will be 0 consequences. He is the son of Sveneld, the warlord who holds Kyiv in his fist. If there's a dispute, his father will sort it out. Oleg, at this exact same time, is also hunting in those very same woods, and he runs into Liud face to face. What happens next, the Chronicle delivers in 2 brutal lines. Oleg asks, "Who is this?" They answer him, "The son of Sveneld." Oleg kills him on the spot. Whether he kills him personally or simply gives the order, the details did not survive. But the absolute core of the event is crucial. This is not a battle. This is an execution. The arrogant son of the Varangian warlord is slaughtered on foreign soil by a young prince who holds an ancestral blood grudge against that very warlord through his father and grandfather. The messengers ride hard for Kyiv. It takes 1 day, maybe a day and a half, to reach Sveneld's mansion. And right here is a scene the Chronicle does not bother to describe, but which can be reconstructed with chilling accuracy. The old man, pushing 70, sits in his great hall on his high seat. Lined up next to him are his heavy chests. Behind him,
his blood-soaked trophies. Surrounding him is the hardened retinue that marched beside him into hell for 30 years. A messenger walks in and announces that his son has been slaughtered, and Sveneld, for the very first time in his entire life, does something he has never, ever done before. He completely loses control. Not outwardly. On the outside, his face probably didn't even twitch. Old Varangians are trained for that. But internally, his entire cold, flawless calculating machine, which has been predicting moves for 40 years, shatters into pieces in a single second.
Because his son was the only piece in his entire system that defied calculation. It was the only warm point in his heart, the only reason the stockpiled silver had any meaning at all. He could have simply taken the vira, blood money. By Russian custom, the prince would have paid a massive sum of silver for a murdered boyar, and the case would have been legally closed. Oleg, most likely, was perfectly willing to pay killing the son of the most powerful man in the state without consequences was something nobody dared to do in the 10th century. Not even a 15-year-old prince in his own backyard. Sveneld refuses the blood money. His iron chests of silver are sitting right there against the wall. His entire life, he threw everything into them that was brought in by tribute, by war, by Byzantine diplomats. His entire life, silver was the definitive answer to any problem. But here, silver is not the answer. Here, the only acceptable answer is exactly one thing: the death of Oleg. And the old voivode walks straight into the princely palace, directly to Yaropolk. To the young boy he has spent 3 years training to let an older man do the thinking for him. To the boy who is used to asking questions and instantly receiving answers. He walks up to him with a fully prepared answer, with a decision born not of cold calculation, but from the exact place in the chest where men who usually do not know how to love still somehow have something beating. The Chronicle records 2 specific things, and both are incredibly important. First, after the murder of Liut, Sveneveld speaks to Yaropolk, verbatim according to the primary chronicle. Pojdi na brat svoj I primi volost jego. March against your brother and take his domain. Second, this phrase is not a one-time piece of advice. The chronicle adds a crucial clarification. Sveneveld says this incessantly, relentlessly, over and over again. This is an exceptionally rare instance where the chronicler drops his usual stoic restraint and explicitly points to a motive. Usually in the primary chronicle, the princes act on their own, and the voivodes simply execute orders. Here it is the exact opposite. The chronicler openly states, Yaropolk did not start this war. The old warlord started it. Yaropolk merely agreed to it. How this works technically we can easily reconstruct. Sveneveld is closer to Yaropolk than anyone else alive. He is present at every council, at every feast, at every review of the collected tribute. The boy prince is roughly 15 years old. 15 is an age where a person is still forming, still deeply dependent on the adults around him,
still unable to fully separate his own thoughts from the thoughts of others. And Sveneld uses this, not brutally. He doesn't scream. He doesn't demand. Simply, every single time the conversation turns to Oleg, he drops one quiet phrase. Your brother murdered my son for no reason. Your brother isn't sending blood money, which means he doesn't recognize your authority. Your brother is rallying his Derevlians, and you know exactly what kind of people they are. If he raised a hand against my blood today, tomorrow he will raise it against yours. For 2 weeks, the boy brushes it off. For a month, he frowns. After 6 months, he starts bringing the topic up himself. After a year, he is openly discussing it with the other boyars. After a year and a half, he completely stops realizing the thought was ever planted. It has become his own. This is the exact same psychological mechanics Sveneld used back when Olga appointed him tutor to the 3-year-old Sviatoslav. A child raised next to a Varangian will become a Varangian warrior. A prince who listens to a warlord every day will become an extension of that warlord. There is only one difference. Back then, 20 years of grueling work produced a Sviatoslav who annihilated Khazaria. Now, 2 years of whispers will produce a Yaropolk who will march out to slaughter his own brother. Sveneld, it seems, no longer cares about this difference, or he sees it, but simply doesn't give a damn. In this entire calculation, Sveneld has one catastrophic blind spot. He is thinking about the enemy exactly the way he has thought for 40 years. The enemy is Oleg, a 15-year-old boy sitting in provincial Ovruk, with a tiny retinue backed by a local Derevlian militia behind a wooden wall, but with no Varangian mercenaries, no grand army, and no connections across the sea. An enemy who, in an open field against the Kievan army, won't last a single afternoon. This is the absolute truth. In an open field, Oleg will be crushed. But a war between 2 sons of Sviatoslav is not a war contained to a single battlefield. It is a massive, blaring signal, a signal broadcast to the entire state that the Rurikovich dynasty is murdering each other, that the eldest son of Sviatoslav has raised a sword against the middle son, that Kyiv has declared war on a piece of its own territory. And this signal will reach Novgorod. Sitting there is the 3rd brother, Vladimir. By 977, he is around 18, perhaps older. He is not Oleg. He is not waiting in the woods with a ragtag local militia. He is in Novgorod, the port city where heavily armed Varangians from across the Baltic Sea arrive every single season. He has direct connections in Scandinavia. He has his own powerful court, his maternal uncle Dobrynya, his own intelligence network. When the news that Yaropolk has marched on Oleg reaches Novgorod, Vladimir will do exactly one thing, swift and correct. He will load his men onto longships and sail straight across the sea to Scandinavia to hire an army. This is not cowardice. This is ice-cold calculation. While Yaropolk is bogged down butchering Oleg, Vladimir will have time to buy Varangians. Once Oleg is dead, Yaropolk will be completely alone, without his brother in Ovruch, without his brother in Novgorod, with an exhausted army and exactly one old voivode standing beside him. And that is when Vladimir will return.
Sveneld fails to calculate this entirely. Or rather, he perfectly knows how to calculate it. He did it his whole life. But right now, he isn't doing the math, because his flawless calculating machine is completely consumed by one single objective: the agonizing death of Oleg. Everything else is just background noise. This is the horrific price the old Varangian will pay for doing something for the very first time in his life with his heart. He won't pay with money, not with power, not even with his own life. He will pay with the total collapse of the entire system he spent 40 years building. In the spring or early summer of 977, the exact month is not named in the Chronicle, Yaropolk marches out of Kyiv with his army, heading straight for Ovruch. The army is Kievan, which means its heavy core is made up of Sveneld's retinue. These are the exact same 300 elite Varangians who, 30 years ago, dressed better than the prince's own men, who burned Ital, and who survived the hell of Derevlian. Plus Yaropolk's own junior retinue, plus the general militia gathered from the Kievan lands, totaling several thousand men. Oleg in Ovruch can deploy at the absolute maximum 1,000. The distance from Kyiv to Ovruch is about 150 versts, roughly 100 miles. The army marches for 4 or 5 days. Oleg knows they are coming well in advance. Messengers reach Ovruch much faster than an army on foot. He has two choices: lock himself in the city and endure a brutal siege, or march out into the open field and try to break the Kievans before they reach the walls. He chooses the latter, and it is a fatal mistake. The battle takes place somewhere just outside Ovruch. The Chronicle doesn't name the exact field. It does not last long. Oleg's peasant militia, stretched out along the dirt road, instantly crumbles under the terrifying charge of Sveneld's heavy Varangian infantry. The formation shatters. A retreat begins, which in seconds turns into a blind, panicked rout. Everyone runs, both infantry and cavalry, sprinting toward the only shelter available for miles: the city. Ovruch sits on a hill surrounded by steep earthen ramparts and a deep moat. The only entrance is a wooden bridge. The bridge is extremely narrow, designed to bottleneck attackers, wide enough for a man on foot or a single rider. Beneath the bridge is the moat, plunging deep, with water or thick mud at the bottom, and hundreds of terrified men sprinting for their lives from the Kievan army. All smash into this tiny bridge at the exact same moment. A deadly crush happens instantly. The first men step onto the bridge, but the panicked mob behind them pushes blindly forward, and those clinging to the edges are shoved off into the moat. They plunge into the water, weighed down by their armor. They fall along with screaming horses. They fall on top of each other. The men at the bottom desperately try to claw their way out,
But from above, new bodies and new horses keep raining down on their heads. Olegus, somewhere right in the middle of this screaming mass.
Maybe on a horse, maybe already on foot. According to the Chronicle, he is violently shoved off the bridge into the moat, and from above, in the minutes that follow, dozens of other retreating men plunge into the pit right on top of him. A crushing avalanche of bodies, horses, heavy wooden shields, and steel weapons. By the time the panic finally stops, Oleg is at the absolute bottom of the moat, buried under multiple layers of dead and dying men. The battle is over. Ovruch is wide open. The Kievan army casually walks into the city. Yaropolk, not yet knowing that his brother is dead, issues an order to find him. Oleg is not in the city. He is not among the captured retinue. He is not in the palace. One of the boyars makes a grim guess. Check the moat. They start dragging the bodies out, hauling them up one by one, laying them out in a long row on the dirt in front of the bridge. By the end of the day, as the sun is already setting, they find Oleg. Crushed, his armor caved in, having suffocated to death in the mud of his own city's moat. They carry the body to Yaropolk, and here is a scene the Chronicle preserved almost word for word. Oleg's body is laid down before Yaropolk in the dirt, resting on a cloak, exactly as it was customary to lay out fallen princes in the 10th century. Yaropolk young, 18 years old, having never seen his own brother dead before, looks down, and, according to the Chronicle, he begins to weep. He weeps, standing right over the body, and standing right next to him is Sveneld. And the prince utters a phrase that the chronicler almost certainly wrote down from the lips of eyewitnesses. A short phrase directed straight at the old voivode. Vij, segoti yesi kotel. Look, this is what you wanted. 6 words. Formally, it is a stinging rebuke. Practically, it is the absolute death sentence for the entire power structure Sveneld had spent the last 3 years building. Because inside these 6 words is a terrifying admission. Yaropolk admits he did not want this war. The old man standing next to him wanted it. And now, the boy sees for the very first time exactly what this war has led to. And for the very first time out, Louis separates his own will from the will of his voivode. This is the breaking point, not in a military sense. In a military sense, Sveneld just won a total victory. Oleg is dead. Ovruch is taken. But in a political sense, Yaropolk, who spent 3 years speaking with Sveneld's voice, says you for the first time, separating it completely from we. What Sveneld says in response, the Chronicle does not record. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps he just stands there in silence, staring down at the bruised corpse of the boy prince who caused the death of his own son, and feels absolutely nothing. Neither dark satisfaction nor crushing guilt, just a hollow, echoing emptiness where vengeance was supposed to be, but for some reason isn't. If you truly think about it, this is the most terrifying moment in his entire life. Not because he lost. He doesn't know he lost yet. but because he got exactly what he wanted and realized it meant absolutely nothing. His son did not rise from the dead. His massive chests of silver are still sitting against the wall in his great hall, exactly as they were. Yaropolk is still the exact same boy he was yesterday, only now this boy has looked at him with open disgust for the very first time. And what comes next is something Sveneld cannot yet see. During the exact same week that Oleg's crushed body is being hauled out of the muddy moat in Overchup in Novgorod, Vladimir receives the news of what happened, and he makes a decision that Sveneld completely failed to calculate. He boards his ships and sails across the sea. A. The man who is no longer in the Chronicle. From the summer of 977 onward, the name Sveneld completely disappears from the primary chronicle. He doesn't die, he just vanishes. The final mention of him is tied to the war for Ovruk. After that, the chronicle details the remaining years of Yaropolk's reign, talks about Polotsk, about the bloody matchmaking with Rognida, about Vladimir's terrifying return. But Sveneld is nowhere to be found in these stories, not as an advisor, not as a general, not even as a name sitting at the feast. This is bizarre. A man of his immense age and terrifying authority does not leave the stage silently. If he had died, the chronicler almost certainly would have written it down. The deaths of supreme Varangian warlords in the 10th century were major events that were always recorded. If he had been formally stripped of his title and exiled, that too would likely have been recorded. High-profile dismissals were documented, but the chronicler is dead silent, and this heavy silence is perhaps the most eloquent testimony of Sveneld's final years. He is, in all likelihood, still alive, probably still living right there in Kyiv, probably sitting in his massive timber mansion, surrounded by the exact same iron chests lined up against the wall. But he is no longer invited to handle the affairs of the state. He is not called into the prince's chambers. He is not consulted about impending wars. He is not paraded in front of foreign ambassadors. We do not know exactly what transpired between Yaropolk and Sveneld following the phrase, "Look, this is what you wanted." The chronicle completely skips over the fallout, but from the indisputable fact that Sveneld completely vanishes from the political arena after 977, we can draw one very cautious conclusion. The prince, having seen for the first time exactly where the old voivode's whispers led, a very simple thing. He just stopped listening to him. This isn't a violent screaming match. This isn't an execution. It's just distance. The old man no longer arrives at the council early. Or he does arrive, but nobody asks for his opinion anymore. Half a year later, he stops coming altogether. A year later, he is completely forgotten as an active political player. A retirement like this doesn't come with a formal date. It is never officially announced. It simply happens slowly, mundanely, until one day, the man who stood next to the throne for 30 years wakes up and realizes that he is no longer standing next to the throne. In Sveneld's place, a new name emerges, Blood.
The Chronicles says very little about him. His title, voivode, his position, Yaropolk's closest advisor. Where he came from is completely unknown. The Chronicle provides absolutely no details about his lineage, his military record, or his connections. And this is highly suspicious in itself. A man like this does not just materialize out of thin air. In 10th century Kyiv, reaching the status of a top boyar is the brutal result of decades of bloody service, long campaigns, and massive shares of the gathered tribute. A random nobody does not suddenly get to whisper in the prince's ear. There is a theory, it is not explicitly confirmed by the sources, but it fits the historical logic flawlessly, that Blood was one of Sveneld's own men, a junior officer in his personal retinue, perhaps one of the men who marched with him 30 years ago into the Derevlian lands, then to Khazaria, then to the Danube. A man who spent his entire career quietly observing exactly how the old Varangian master did his work and learned the trade. This theory is not hard fact. The Chronicle doesn't confirm it, but the exact mechanics of what Blood does next repeats Sveneld's methods so flawlessly that it is almost impossible to dismiss it as a mere coincidence. He materializes right next to Yaropolk at the absolute perfect moment, right when the old man is fading away into the shadows and the prince finds himself without his habitual senior advisor for the first time. The empty space next to the throne is instantly filled. Blood is much younger than Sveneld, maybe by 20 years, maybe 30. He has no legendary reputation, no massive private army, no towering stacks of silver chests lining his walls. But he possesses the exact same terrifying skill that the old Varangian had at 40, arriving first with a fully prepared answer and speaking quietly, but in a way that ensures the prince remembers every word. And Yaropolk, who spent 3 years speaking with Sveneld's voice, simply begins speaking with Blood's voice. There is only one catastrophic difference. Sveneld, even at the absolute peak of his shadowy manipulation, worked primarily in the interests of his own power, which meant that, as long as he was alive and in power, he worked to maintain the stability of the state. Blood is working in someone else's interests. Whose interests exactly will become brutally clear very soon. In the spring of 980, Vladimir returns from across the Baltic Sea. He does not come back alone. The Chronicle states that he arrived with many Varangians. Scandinavian sagas heavily hint at the exact same reality. A prince who spends 2 years gathering an army in the harsh norths is a prince who returns with hundreds, perhaps thousands, of elite professional killers. A force vastly larger than what Oleg possessed in Rurik. A force entirely capable of fighting Yaropolk's Kievan army toe-to-toe. The first target he strikes is Polotsk. Sitting there is Prince Rogvolod, Varangian by blood, completely independent from Kyiv, ruling his own sovereign land. He has a daughter, Rognida, who is officially betrothed to Yaropolk. Vladimir marches on Polotsk, storms the city, slaughters Rogvolod and his sons right in front of the girl, and then takes Rognida as his wife by sheer brutal force. This is not a political gesture. This is a terrifying declaration. Vladimir is showing to his older brother and to absolutely everyone else that he is playing a game
where there are no limits whatsoever. From the smouldering ruins of Polotsk, he marches straight on Kyiv. Yaropolk, inside Kyiv, is not defenseless at this moment. He has a retinue entirely capable of holding the city. Kyiv is heavily fortified. The walls are solid stone in the most critical choke points, and thick timber everywhere else, but incredibly strong. Trying to storm Kyiv head-on is a grueling, unimaginably bloody affair. If Yaropolk simply locks the gates and sits in a siege, Vladimir will be stuck freezing outside the walls for a month, maybe 2, maybe 3. During that time, a lot of things can happen. Starvation in the besiegers' camp, disease, Pechenegs hearing about the war and showing up to raid their exposed rear, reinforcements from neighboring allies. Yaropolk absolutely must sit out the siege. It is the only rational military decision. But Blood tells him otherwise. The Chronicle explicitly records that Blood began to deceive Yaropolk, Nachal lestiti Yaropolku. He began to lie to him, to feed him poison disguised as advice. He tells him this: the people of Kyiv are completely unreliable. There is a massive conspiracy brewing inside the city. They secretly sympathize with Vladimir. If we stay locked in a siege, our own people will open the gates in the dead of night. We have to leave immediately. Run to Rodnya, tiny fortified town at the mouth of the Rus River, south of Kyiv, right on the border with the wild steppe. It will be much safer there. This is a blatant, catastrophic lie. A lie perfectly calculated for a young prince who no longer has Sveneld standing over him to verify the advice. Yaropolk is 19 or 20 years old. He is commanding a war for the first time in his life, and he believes it. Yaropolk abandons Kyiv. He leads his retinue out and runs to Rodnya. Kyiv is left completely empty. Vladimir casually walks into the capital without swinging a single sword. A fortress city that Yaropolk could have easily held is surrendered because of a single decision made in a council with exactly one man. In Rodnya, exactly what Blood likely planned comes to pass. The town is tiny, the stockpiled provisions are pitiful, and there is nowhere near enough room for a massive retinue. Within a few weeks, crushing starvation sets in. The chronicler preserved a dark proverb that, according to him, was born directly from this exact siege. Misery, like in Rodnya, Beda, jako Virodnya. A chilling reminder that there are some places from which there is simply no way out. And at this exact moment, Blood makes his final move. He convinces Yaropolk that the only possible escape is to negotiate with his brother. Vladimir supposedly is calling for him himself, promising peace, offering to split the lands. He just needs to walk out and talk to him face to face. Yaropolk walks out, with Blood at his side. They travel back to Kyiv, to the princely palace, where Vladimir is already sitting on the throne. The chronicle describes what happens next in brutal, clipped sentences. Yaropolk steps into the antechamber, a narrow, darkened hallway right before the main throne room. The heavy wooden doors slam shut behind him. 2 Varangian mercenaries, hiding in the shadows on either side, raise their swords. Blood pushes his weight against the doors from the inside, so that Yaropolk's men waiting outside cannot break in. Yaropolk is stabbed to death right there on the floor, in the hallway, without a fight, without a formal challenge, without a final word. Exactly how men were butchered in these situations everywhere in the 10th century, fast, quiet, so that the men outside wouldn't realize what was happening until it was already over. The year is 980. Vladimir is the sole absolute ruler of all Rus. Sveneld is completely absent from this scene. He is not at the siege of Kyiv. He is not starving in the Rodnya. He is not standing in the blood-slicked hallway where Yaropolk, the very last prince under whom the old voivode meant anything at all, takes his last breath. Where he is in 980, we do not know. The Chronicle has been absolutely silent about him for 3 years. We can imagine one final frame one that nobody bothered to write down, but which almost certainly happened. The old Varangian, pushing 80 years old, sits alone in his massive timber mansion, in the exact same great hall where 40 years ago he received ambassadors from Igor. Next to him, the heavy iron chests lined up against the wall, thick, locked tight, filled to the brim with silver, Khazar silver, Byzantine silver, Bulgarian silver, with dirhams that once sat in the cold cellars of the Khagan of Itil, with silks that were woven by hand in the royal workshops of Constantinople. The silver is completely intact. The chests are full, but the retinue is gone. Some died of old age, some simply walked over to Vladimir, because the new prince pays in cold silver, while the old voivode no longer collects tribute. Some retired to their own private estates, bought long ago with the blood money from Khazaria. His son has been dead for 5 years. The graveyard where Liut is buried is never mentioned by the chronicler. The prince whom he raised from a 3-year-old boy has been dead for 8 years. His skull, turned into a drinking cup, is somewhere out in the deep Pecheneg steppe, if it even existed at all. The prince whom he manipulated into starting a civil war with his own brother has been dead for 3 months. All that is left are the chests, and if there is a bitter, agonizing symmetry to this ending, it lies precisely in those chests. His entire life, Sveneld believed that silver was the one single thing that could never betray you. Silver doesn't mutiny. It doesn't get sick. It doesn't sail away across the sea to join the Varangians. Silver just sits in a heavy wooden box and waits until you decide to take it. And here it is, sitting right there. And he can take it. But there is absolutely no one left to give it to, and absolutely nothing left to buy. There is no army. There are no wars. There is no young prince who needs to be paid. The silver sits in the chests and means exactly the same thing as raw metal buried deep in the ground. Absolutely nothing. Capital without power is just dust. Sveneld dies sometime between 980 and the early years of Vladimir's reign. There is no exact date. There is no known burial site. There is no grand burial mound. Not a single chronicler deemed it necessary to record the end of a man who stood next to the throne for 40 solid years. The golden era of the great mercenary warlords does not end with a glorious, thundering battle.
It ends with deafening silence in an old timber mansion where nobody ever comes to ask for advice anymore. And this is where the story of Sveneld officially ends. But one single thing remains, the exact reason why we told the story of his life in the first place. Not the dates, not the heavy iron chests, not a name that simply dissolved from the pages of a chronicle without a proper obituary. The question: what exactly happened to this man? Why did a flawless system that he spent 40 years building, which worked with absolute perfection under Igor, under Olga, and under Sviatoslav, shatter into dust in just 3 short years? What exactly did he miscalculate? And did he ever truly have a chance, despite all his terrifying cunning, to survive in the new era that was dawning right as he faded away? The Chronicle does not answer these questions. Answering them is up to us. He outlived 3 of them. Igor butchered in a dark Derevlian forest, Olga dying quietly in her own bed, Sviatoslav turned into a silver-bound cup in the wild steppe. Every single time a prince fell from the top, the old Varangian standing at the bottom took a calm step to the side and emerged completely unscathed. And then a messenger arrived with the news that his son had been slaughtered in someone else's woods. And for the very first time in 40 years, he didn't take a step to the side. He took a step forward. And that, essentially, is the entire story. A gray cardinal only survives as long as he remains gray. The exact second you flush red from rage, from grief, from bitter resentment, the very system you spent your entire life building instantly turns around and begins to crush you. Sveneld was not defeated by Vladimir, not by blood, not by the changing era. He was defeated by a single, dead, arrogant 20-year-old boy who was loved entirely too much. Cold power shatters the second it hits a warm point. This brutal rule is older than the house of Rurik, and it will effortlessly outlive you and me. You can spend 40 years calculating every move, weighing every silver dirham, sneaking your horses through the steppe to avoid an ambush, and then, just once, stand on the wrong side of the table simply because you have a son. And instantly, all your flawless arithmetic becomes completely useless. Sveneld probably realized this in his final years, when the Chronicles simply stopped writing his name. He had plenty of time to think about it. The heavy chests sat against the wall, the loyal retinue drifted away. The messengers knocked on his door, less and less. In that heavy, crushing silence, there were more than enough hours to reflect. But what exactly he thought, we will never know. Just imagine that room. Kyiv, the late 980s. Maybe it's winter. Maybe it's deep into the night. A massive timber mansion where ambassadors from Igor once sat, where men whose names are carved into the 944 treaty with Byzantium once drank at feasts. Now it is completely empty. The hearth burns at half strength. A lone servant, who stayed with the old man to the end, throws another log on the fire once an hour. Lined up along the wall are the heavy chests, 8, 10, maybe more, bound in thick iron, locked tight. Inside them, the exact things that whole armies marched from the Volga to the Danube to bleed for. On the high seat sits a man pushing 80 years old. He stares at the chests. And if there is anyone else left in that room at this exact moment, a servant, a dog, a random passing guest, then that someone might just hear one single short breath. Not a sigh, just an exhale. The sound made by people who stopped expecting anything from life other than the morning a very long time ago. And then, absolute silence. The exact same silence in which he lived the vast majority of his life, and into which he almost certainly vanished. Without a recorded date, without a marked grave, without a single line in the chronicle, just the heavy chests. But while this old man sits out his final nights in his empty, echoing mansion, right there in Kyiv, just a few courtyards away, an entirely different story is already unfolding. It has a name, Rogneda. She is roughly 18 years old. She is the daughter of the Prince of Polotsk. Rogvolodz was his daughter 3 months ago. Now she has no father, no brothers, no home city.
Her family was butchered right in front of her eyes, all on the same day, in the same room, and the man who did it took her by brute force that very night, right over the blood of her family. Then he brought her to Kyiv. He locked her in a mansion. He gave her the title of wife, just one of many, and he told her, "Live." She lives, she cooks, she bears him sons, she sits silently at the feasts, she smiles when he looks at her. She never sheds a tear when he walks out the door to go to the others. For 4 straight years, not a single word of reproach, not a single hysterical scene, not a single attempt to run away. And everyone around her is absolutely certain that she has simply accepted her fate. Everyone except exactly one person, herself. Because one night, Vladimir Sviatoslavich, the future baptizer of Rus, the future saint, the future fair son of Russian epic folklore, will wake up to find a woman standing directly over him in the pitch black, holding a knife. And that is only the very beginning of her story. Until the next episode drops, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it.